History has seen the coming and going of a great many peoples. Honor the Etruscans, Latins, Veneti, Goths, Visigoths, Vandals, Celts, and Canaanites, who have been wiped out through the intermixture of tribes and the march of civilization. It is a tragedy that they were lost. Their unique arts, dresses, meals, and customs forever shall exist only on pages. It is perhaps no one's fault that they are gone, but the same cannot be said of the attempts at extermination which the early modern world has visited upon other native peoples. The first visits of Hernando Cortez and Christopher Columbus to the New World brought with them the machinery of subjugation and domination. Soon, thousands of native South Americans were put to work in mines where they soon perished. Swaths of human beings were exterminated, entire races reduced to the status of an endangered species. Today, these peoples, including the natives of North America, are few in number and have suffered from a dilution of their ancestry by contact with colonizers. Modernity has not treated them well, nor will it treat any extant peoples well. Millions of dollars are spent in nations around the world conserving even the most insignificant animals. Entire forests remain unharvested to provide for tigers, leopards, and pandas a home and existence. Voluntary and state societies spring up to preserve birds, canines, felids, and marsupials. We forbid the drilling of oceans and wild land for the sake of nature's inhabitants. Yet no one has dared to ask the question, why do we not preserve human beings? Daily, the habitats of our endangered humans are swarmed with invasive species. Multinational corporations pillage and exploit the environment. Nature has been transformed into a marketable commodity. Entire regions laid waste in order to facilitate the operations of a cold and impersonal market machine. It is time to speak against this crisis. Under the guise of a humanitarian creed, the dominant political forces are constructing a system of ethics and mass movement which will end in the eradication of all distinct peoples on Earth through their merging into a single, unified humanity. It goes by many duplicitous names: humanism, progress, diversity, inclusion, and anti-racism. This cult of human mass maligns all those who wish to keep intact the integrity of their people. It works to tear apart the distinct and exclusive communities that men have built for the sake of their social unity and comfort. It aims to replace all existing and integral culture with imperfect, materialist substitutions that can be understood and enjoyed by all. This system does not know origins. It is blind to them. Alain de Benoit called it the ideology of sameness. It flattens all distinctions, denies all patterns, and nullifies all qualities. In the place of concrete human men, it proposes an equal humanity with one head, one body, and one soul, something that puts Dante's De Monarchia to shame. Its proponents have variously called it internationalism or socialism, poor names for what truly amounts to the destruction of all human sociality. Commonly, it flies the liberal or conservative flag, declaring that all are individuals, and thus, being only a numerical quantity, all are equal. To say that men are equal is to say that they are identical. In support of the ideology of sameness, this cult of mass humanity rallies behind democratic systems which prohibit any of their subject peoples a voice in the composition of their countries. Entire nations are swamped with foreigners, and despite the loud protestations of their Volk, the flow does not stop. Politicians, who are mere technicians of a market machine that depends on cheap labor for its operation, offer up a great number of justifications for the denial of people's sovereignty. Immigration is good for the economy. We are a nation of immigrants. The immigrants will assimilate. The nation is just a big idea. The foreigners are natural conservatives. Even more pernicious, some technicians don the guise of opposition. They promise immigration reform, nationalism, even remigration. Yet these policies never come to fruition, and the same technicians who promised a solution perform a volte-face, admitting in millions more from abroad. The cult of human mass and the extinction of nations is not a policy issue. It is a systemic issue. The dominance of the market in liberal countries, the oligarchic nature of democratic rule, and the reality of what Karl Marx called the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie comprise the central problem. To ensure that today's peoples do not disappear, it is necessary to completely replace the system. Though the present work contains an unbroken thread, a single line of reasoning, It is best approached as a series of elements which inform the struggle against the cult of human mass. They are both theory and polemic, analysis and manifesto. Many questions that have pursued the right will be answered here. How a right revolutionary movement can succeed through political means, how monarchy can form in the absence of a nobility, how people can organize to create the political change they wish to see. In addition, we will also endeavor to explore the nature and operation of political power, as well as the formation of states. The purpose of such elaboration is to demystify the political from all manner of either idealist or materialist divagations, as well as from forms of individualist or psychologistic analysis. The real political reality is found within the sociality of discrete groups and the formation of political entities around such groups through a process called formalization. It is to the maintenance and preservation of social realities and ties that we turn to. Race is not merely a social construct, but rather an ineradicable element of lived experience. Ethnicity, family, and all the various groupings and interactions which stem therefrom have been the backbone of all human interactions since the Neolithic. Race has been recognized since the time of the ancient Greeks and Egyptians. It is this grand tradition of human being and acting that we wish to safeguard. Finally, we will elaborate on the theory of omniparticularity, which is the political defense of discrete human differences. In short, it is the defense of the existence of peoples. Without the concept of omniparticularity, all movements which attempt to nominally defend diversity or difference will militate in the direction of their opposites. It is our hope that omniparticularity will become the basis for a worldwide revolution in international and racial relations. Domination, subjugation, genocide, and replacement will all end after its adoption. The terms right and left will be used throughout this book. The left refers specifically to all variants of communist and socialist ideology and the adherents thereof, while the right refers to conservative, reactionary, and nationalist movements. The term liberalism will be used to denote the predominant form of government in modernity, that of the democratic and capitalist state, as well as forms of social democracy. Special gratitude must be paid to Alain de Benoit and the Nouvelle Droit, whose conception of differentialism has greatly inspired omniparticularity. To all our brothers in white identitarian and white advocacy movements, we give also our sincerest thanks. It is due to the intransigence, bravery, and honesty of these men that one may speak of the possibility of the preservation of our race. Europe is in crisis, but it is merely the canary in the coal mine. Once Europe falls, other continents will fall as well. Entire nations will collapse unless a swift reaction is made against the cult of human mass. Whole races will be reduced to diaspora, and then nothing. There will be no race. Diversity will be subsumed in a swamp of human flesh. The time to avert this is today. Introduction. The central motion of modernity is towards singularity. All differences, whether they be cultural, political, ethnic, or racial, melt away under the currents of universalism. The notion of the West as a melting pot of cultures, ethnicities, and races has resulted in the gradual unraveling of the social fabric and the erosion of genuine diversity. But this threat, the erosion of world diversity, originates not just from the left, but from the right and center. Despite the best wishes of some of the right, its ideologies and slogans serve as a mask for the gradual unraveling of cultural particularity and ethnic solidarity. Its defense of the West is fundamentally a defense of modernist Faustian values, which results in the decentering of racial solidarity and thus also of diversity. In addition, the action and philosophy of universalist liberalism has been the primary substratum for the leveling of difference in the West. From this point of view, individuals, without roots nor qualities, are seen as the fundamental unit of society, who are fungible and replaceable. In far-right and postmodern left movements, there are gropings toward a reaction against this problem. The far-right emphasizes racial and ethnic unity, while the postmodern left promotes a vision of multiplicitous and contextual approaches to knowledge and living, which break apart rigid modernist unities. But such forces are unaware of the central raison d'etre, which ought to be at the head of their thought and movement, omniparticularity. As such, while nominally opposing global homogenization, they in various ways end up ratifying it. The far right, with the exception of currents inspired by the Nouvelle Droit, adopts a supremacist worldview which renders illegitimate any way of life or ethnic reality contrary to its own. It is a kind of group egoism for the white race and the constructed ideals of a bourgeois whiteness which threatens to take over the globe in a wash of imperialism. The postmodern left analyzes the problem through the lens of contemporary and historical power relationships and the genealogy of the dominance of white and Western powers over non-white, non-Western peoples within their own territories. As such, this discourse has had the effect of delegitimizing not just the ways of life of white peoples, but also the very existence of them as a race. The principle that people ought to be free from racial and ethnic oppression becomes itself particular to races within their historical contexts, giving carte blanche for the universal destruction of the sovereignty of white peoples. What in spirit is a defense of particularity and the solidarity of peoples inverts and becomes an attack against a specific ethnic group, recapitulating hostility against the other. In this case, it is the white race which is the uncivilized other, and non-white peoples who are truly human. Such is the outcome of critical theory, which casts any view which is not inherently revolutionary as reactionary. As Marcuse framed it in Revolution and Counter-Revolution, what became necessary was permanent revolution, meant not in the Trotskyist sense as the final consummation of communist principles, but rather as a revolution without end, which indefinitely subverts itself through dialectical negation. As such, there's no real telos behind critical race theory. Its only end is to deal a blow against the dominators rather than to attain a state of final or ideal justice, a dream which is ultimately cast as restrictive, instrumental, and one-dimensional. In such a way, it manages to legitimize a form of anti-white racism while assuring itself of its anti-racist credentials. It furthers the final end of homogenizing the world. A world which is devoid of distinct white peoples is a world in which diversity has been dealt an irrevocable blow. Likewise, criticism of the notion of progress has become widespread. The far right sees in progress the unraveling of traditional Western values in favor of a postmodern, non-Western kaleidoscope of ways of living and knowing. They perceive the dissolution of traditional sexual normativity, gender normativity, and the bourgeois values of temperance and accumulation, against which they seek to mount a defense. The far right, however, is unaware that under the banner of Western values, it includes everything that has been a modern historical development and which paved the way for the aforementioned dissolution. At once it denigrates progress whilst valorizing it under the guise of whiteness, technical mastery, the domination of nature, the asymptotic increase of production and wealth, the domination of space, the primacy of positivism, etc. This defense is also offense. The domination of space and the premise that these modern Western values are superior logically concludes with imperialism and the export of Western civilization, which is to say, Enlightenment values, to the rest of the world. The aim of opposing progress, which is to preserve the ways of white peoples, clashes against the conflation of progress with the white race. Conversely, the postmodern left suffers from a similar cleavage in values. The defense of the ways of life of indigenous peoples and a stringent critique of logocentrism clashes with the socialist dream of providing to all peoples the right and possibility of having prosperity and a means of life, which in itself would require the industrialization of the world and the planetization of progress, the transposition of white modes of production and knowing to non-white peoples. In either case, particularity becomes subsumed by singularity. The necessity of spreading a single mode of living, producing, acting, and being to all peoples, either through their homogenization, which is the practical discounting of real differences in character and qualities, through a false and quantitative diversity. In the case of the right, it is through their extermination. The need for a principled opposition to progress thus comes into view, one that is consistent and suited for its purpose. It is to this end that the present author has developed Omniparticularity. The underside of progress is violence. The accomplishments of modernity required a fundamental reordering of human relationships to such an extent that the traditional ways of life that previously dominated, clan, tribe, fealty, village, etc., were eradicated. This motion, the destruction of organic bonds and the rearrangement of relations, is the primary desideratum of colonialism and imperialism. The flattening of the regional particularities of Indians and Africans, the enslavement of humans which broke apart families and communities, the import of foreign, white identities and customs into the lives of the colonized, were at the final stage in the process of these actions, an attempt to transition non-whites away from primitivism toward modernization. Conversely, the breakup of traditional ways of life can be motivated by humanitarian goals. In the Soviet Union, Stalin's plan of rapid industrialization led to the starvation deaths of millions in Ukraine, who became fodder for industrial urban development. It was the necessity of feeding the urban factory workers that led him to engage in the policy of the confiscation of grain and valuables from the hinterlands. The same process unfolded during Mao's Great Leap Forward. All volitional acts toward progress necessitate a clean slate, which can only be obtained at the cost of human relationships and lives. It is a cliché fact that many technological developments have arisen out of the struggle for military dominance, thus evincing the violent and discontinuous nature of progress. The internet was invented by DARPA and the United States Navy. The development of microchips was driven partly by contracts with the U.S. Air Force. Global positioning technology was driven by military necessity, and even further back in history, canned food arose out of logistical need during the Napoleonic Wars. It is not an exaggeration to say that the entire complex of computational and communications technology upon which humanity is reliant in the information age was a result of military research and development, whose primary concern is to exact violence upon the enemies of nations. As a result of this technical struggle, war has become increasingly expensive in terms of life and destruction. Modern technology amplifies the capabilities of militaries to harm, including the destruction of entire cities, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Karl Marx is well known for exposing that the fundamental basis for profit, and therefore progress, under capitalism is exploitation by means of the control of private property, which is enforced through state violence. The scale of this exploitation has increased exponentially under capitalism. The centralization of wealth garnered through profit-seeking has enabled large-scale capital investment, which facilitates research and development. The Industrial Revolution enabled vast amounts of extracted surplus, which drove profits skyward, while simultaneously enabling alienation and dehumanization. Marx, in Capital, showed how dreadful and dangerous were the conditions of the proletariat in 19th century England. Likewise, the heights of the Western, particularly American, consumer lifestyle are maintained through the appropriation of the products of third world laborers who work under woeful and inhumane conditions, frequently under totalitarian governments. Violence is implicit in every transaction. Progress is therefore not a venerable ideal. Instead, it has a ruthless, unifying logic, which is the motion from the human toward the inhuman, from a distributed whole toward a chaotic center. The closeness of progress with humanitarianism elucidates this problem. The idea of a unified human brotherhood is a subversion of the reality of lived experience. Our bonds pertain only to concrete people and groups with whom we can have physical and social contact. Humanity is an abstraction that one can never meet nor converse with. It is perhaps the most inhuman of all things. As Joseph de Maistre wrote, "Now there is no such thing as man in this world. In my life I have seen Frenchmen, Italians, Russians, and so on. I even know, thanks to Montesquieu, that one can be Persian. But as for man, I declare I've never encountered him." Foundations of Omniparticularity. Humanity has no distinct qualities. It is defined only by that which we have in common, which in a political sense is largely banal. If all humans were identical, then politics and ethics would be unnecessary, as all would have one interest, one character, and one type of action. There would be no real conflict of ends, no conflict of visions, nor conflict of culture. As such, any political system based upon the benefit of humanity can only ever reach towards singularity and homogeneity, the elimination of politics, which, as Hannah Arendt has argued, is the basis for totalitarianism. Humanity, if it is to be valid and useful as a concept, must include the reality of the human condition, which consists of multiple unities and discrete groups, all different phenotypically and socially. However, this reorientation of the idea of humanity renders humanity conceptually redundant except in relation to the non-human and suprahuman, as well as in the special sense of an underlying human essence or nature. In other words, humanity, in relation to itself, is meaningless except as a taxonomic or ontological categorization. To say humanity in its socio-political sense is thus to speak of humanities, whites, Asians, and blacks, Frenchmen, Chinese, and Senegalese. To defend humanities is to defend difference, which is bound up with the principle of exclusivity and the practical existence of boundaries. This defense is called omniparticularity. Liberal and leftist humanitarianism conceives of humans as identical individuals without any prior group relation. Individuals are the substratum of any group, and thus the individual interest presides over the group interest. This assumption, the individual or subject being the primary locus of political and social life, leads to a fragmentary conception of difference and identity, which is vulnerable to the criticism that it is indefinitely granular and thus arbitrary. Such is the question of postmodern identity politics, which aims to celebrate and liberate difference at the microscopic level, leading to the gradual unraveling of the social fabric which it nominally wishes to preserve. This granularity of difference is ultimately self-subverting, as it approaches a quantitative and formless conception. If difference exists, then it must exist as the differentiation of forms. One quality of form is distinction, without which anything it informs would collapse into pure matter, which cannot have difference as a property. Distinction is also discreteness, the difference of one kind from another. Animals are not plants, colors are not sounds, canids are not felids. For this reason, difference is not indefinitely granular. It exists as a characteristic of discrete categories, which only have descriptive utility to the extent that they both deduce commonalities and define differences. In the political realm, this principle has primary relevance for the question of race and ethnicity. The humanitarian lens conceives of a fungible humanity without color, whilst at once celebrating its diversity. This is the origin of its homogenizing effect. Its individualist basis renders it incapable of celebrating difference because, according to the principle of the identity of indiscernibles, there is only one individual. But there's clearly more than one human, so humans must be something other than individuals. Instead, they are persons, and persons have qualities, the body, and relations, sociality. Thus, they can legitimately be sorted into categories and thus distinguished from one another both in the personal and group level. As such, to speak of persons is also to speak of groups, and to speak of groups is to speak of persons. The modern dichotomy of individualism versus collectivism is false simply because the two principles are corollaries of one another. Persons are born into groups, and groups consist of persons with particular qualities, i.e., race. As such, the locus of society is not individuals, not even persons. It is a holistic and inclusive social reality in which persons and groups participate in one another. The proper level of analysis, then, is groups, which all socially depend on a prior organizing principle, their efficient cause. The family is the first group into which any person is born, and this group is prior to any person's subjective experience, unless said person is born into a communal structure, such as a kibbutz, where the parents are unknown. But to elaborate on such marginal exceptions would bring us too far afield. As such, the personality forms in relation to the group, rather than the group forming in relation to the personality. For this reason, the categorization of humans is a necessary fact, which can only be defeated through the eradication either of the social bonds inherited by the person or the eradication of the group itself. Furthermore, the family is a primordial human institution. According to Lewis Morgan, the original families were matrilineal, and the formation of patrilineal and patriarchal families was a later development. All human societies have had pair bonding in some system of marriage. Regardless, the origin of human society and social life in the family is rarely disputed. The family, and its varieties, therefore, is the fundamental, natural basis of the social arrangement, and all other variants, the commune, the collective, etc., are based in the negation of it. Families have qualities and possess the property of discreteness, distinction from the other by means of having those qualities in common. These qualities are generally ancestral and phenotypic, but can also include social and behavioral properties such as temperament, custom, or religious affiliation, as well as primarily relation to a common history. All emergent human organizations originate in hierarchical structures of decreasing particularity. Family is the furthest extension proximately from ethnicity. It may seem as though family is the center of differentiation, but in reality, the family only has its existence as a contingency of the others. Ethnicity is an extension of race, and race is difference in ancestry, which is the abstract origin of human differences and thus the highest category possible, but which one can nevertheless not identify with. And ethnicity is a collection of families with a common history and race. Variation exists within both family and ethnicity, since any categorization of the natural and social world must admit to variation, but it is nonetheless possible to deduce from the aforementioned commonalities various unities that comprise the higher order strata. Just as families participate in a unity of particularities based upon a calculus of differences and similarities, so too do ethnicities. A Frenchman may be provincial or Parisian, an Italian may be Sicilian or Venetian, but nonetheless, a Frenchman is not an Italian, just as the Smiths are not the Joneses. On this matter, it is necessary to address border cases, which are increasingly common in the modern age of mass movement and individualism. The mixture of, for example, French and Italian ancestry constitutes its own category sui generis, and in extension, it is obvious that there are no pure ethnicities, only discrete ones. This applies also to race. Omniparticularity, however, is rooted in origins. It is to the originary sense of ethnicity that a state has reference to. Therefore, a French state must pertain to the white peoples who settled France and had their ethnogenesis in France, and a Mexican state must pertain to the discrete category which has emerged out of the colonial interrelations between their original Spanish and native bloodlines. Ancestry is the fundamental basis for the generation of particularities. Race is a population-level difference in ancestry, and it originates out of geographical isolation. Without race, then humans do not have the possibility of existing as discrete, particular groups because there is no fundamental principle of differentiation. In other words, isolation is the origin point for human differentiation. That differentiation is the fundamental basis for sociality. Ethnicity originates from the race. For families to cross ethnic distinctions is for families to invalidate the fundamental basis for their material existence. Each lower order category is based on the higher as a principle. For this reason, it is irrational to permit the intermixture of races. Likewise, for families of different ethnicities to intermix, this invalidates the fundamental basis of the ethnicity. The basic structure of human categories is clear, but to fully illustrate the principle of omniparticularity, it is necessary to determine why diversity, or particularity, is desirable over homogeneity. Theoretically, humanity could merge into a single ancestral block, thus making redundant the concepts of race and ethnicity. However, such an outcome would be contrary to nature, since nature is fundamentally multiplicitous. There is not a single species of animal that has no subspecies. Nature isolates, and so nature produces variance. The mass movement of peoples and the erosion of nations and borders is a distinctly modern phenomenon enabled by the breakdown of national feeling, the displacement of racial and ethnic solidarity, as well as the rise of individualist ideology. For this reason, it is rare among ancient and medieval peoples to engage in racial and ethnic intermixing, except on the boundaries, usually accomplished through conquest. Prehistoric peoples did indeed mix frequently, but again, this must be seen primarily as the result of conflict, which we as a social species should endeavor to prevent. Homogenization is contrary to nature. However, to declare impermissible that which is contrary to nature is to commit the naturalistic fallacy. Such reasoning is fallacious, however, only to the extent that deviation from nature does not have negative effects, nor cultural and social costs. Particularity has a genuinely enriching effect. The panoply of cultural and artistic styles, cuisine, music, literature, philosophy, etc., contributes to the human overall. Particularity carries with it the promise of the autonomy of groups. Having a particular, isolated space, they are free to pursue their distinct ends without interference, from which we derive the particular folkways and cultures of those groups. Without particularity, then the sum of human creativity would be drastically reduced, and the experience of the world's peoples would melt into a homogeneous slime. Moreover, differences reinforce the solidarity of groups. Through recognizing the other, humans recognize themselves as distinct and bound together. It is difference, and sometimes conflict, which drives ethnogenesis, which serves to enable social cooperation through enhancing the possibility of mutual trust. Groups consisting of particular qualities and character enable the prediction of behavior, and predictability of behavior generates social trust. A completely homogeneous humanity, conversely, consists entirely of idiosyncrasies upon which no stable groups can form. This absence of groups creates conditions of egoism, which necessitates the creation of the total state in order to manage and unify these individuals, thus eroding autonomy. Ethnic groups, on the other hand, can foster autonomy and the sense of self-rule, and so the total state is unnecessary to keep order. Mutual difference is commonality, while universal commonality is anarchy. Moreover, within the concept of natural law, nature as it pertains to humans must mirror the good. That which deviates from human nature is subhuman, and to participate in our intrinsic nature is also to participate in the good. Given that humanity is multiple, it must be a law of human nature that mankind in its earthly state is based on the principle of diversity. In other words, God intended man to be diverse, and so it is just that man maintains his own diversity. From such, we derive a divine mandate for the existence of discrete races. The leftist and postmodern conception of diversity is false, since it fundamentally is quantitative and thus self-defeating. Quantity is that which only has number as a property. As such, this false notion of diversity is merely the sum of individual variants, admitting no discreteness nor form. It is thus closer to homogenization, the symbol of chaos, than diversification, the symbol of order. On the other hand, diversity, in the sense of mutual difference, or difference of kinds, is foundational on the existence of form, and thus of categories and groups. Form has boundaries setting it apart from other things. The difference between false diversity and omniparticularity is the difference between television static and a stained glass window. The former has no boundaries, and so it is a homogeneous and unintelligible image. The latter has boundaries, and so it is an intelligible image. The final end of diversity is to express in intelligible form differences, and so the leftist conception, which reduces difference to a pure, undifferentiated quantity, renders itself null. The overarching purpose behind the leftist conception of diversity is the elimination of conquest and extermination, but to attribute to nationalism or racialism as necessary the act of domination is incorrect. The cause of this domination is not nationalism considered as a principle, but rather the cause lies in the notion of supremacy. Nationalism tied to group egoism and interest results in conflict over space and resources. Notions of cultural and racial superiority engender the failure to recognize the other, since superiority is contingent upon the valorization of personal success. Success, as well as the attendant values of honor and glory, becomes the existential criterion. Therefore, unsuccessful people do not, in their view, have the right to exist. Omniparticularity, conversely, is foundational upon the value of diversity in terms of its ability to facilitate sociality, as well as cultural invention and expression. It is the value of this expression that underlies the validity of races, ethnicities, and nations. Thus, the nations of all peoples have the universal right to exist free from depredation and conquest. Each people enjoys the right of ethnic and racial sovereignty, the right to particularity, and the basic social organizing principles of society reach their full consummation. Subjugation, still, is legitimate under one specific circumstance. Nations under omniparticularity have the duty to uphold the categorical and existential integrity of their own and other peoples, and where this duty is violated, the nation in question must be subjugated in order to preserve the universal order. To frame this question as a paradox of rights would fail. Liberal theorists have long attempted to resolve the problem of freedom in such a way, but in spite of their pronounced nationalism, it is still fundamentally irrational. Universal rights must be applied evenly and on a consistent basis, even to such an extent that it would threaten the existence of that right, whereas universal duties can survive unevenness and irregularity. The paradox of universal rights can be phrased, the right to X must be restricted by the right to X. It is a contradiction. A universal duty, however, conceives of the proper consequences when an actor fails to uphold its duty. The duty to Y is enforced by the principle of X. Practically, the duty to uphold omniparticularity is enforced by the subjugation of those nations that fail to uphold their duty. The subjugation cannot take place in such a way as to mix, homogenize, or exterminate the subjugated peoples. Rather, the subjugator must act in such a way as to preserve the particularity of the people in question. This duty pertains to governments, and governments which fail it must be replaced or controlled and then eventually released to the people. As such, subjugation under these parameters does not violate omniparticularity. Omniparticularity applies to all socially relevant groups, such as communities and castes. The preservation of distinct social groups is necessary, since to violate their integrity is to violate the overarching principle which enables them, i.e., the family. The uniformity of individualist doctrine has eradicated communities by sublimating all relationships into abstract contracts and quid pro quo relationships of transactional self-benefit. Liberalism accomplishes the marketization of bonds and relationships, the transformation of persons into individual, calculating economic actors. The bourgeois mentality which underpins the bourgeois family is emblematic of this fact, since the value of a descendant is contingent upon his ability to produce profit and engage in productive labor or enterprise. Such marketization rends apart communities by disrupting the existence of a common weal, thus violating omniparticularity. The principle of omniparticularity ensures that the communitarianism of writers such as Tunis or Lash can find expression within society rather than to be an impossible desideratum. An obvious criticism of the aforementioned schema is the problem that, if categorical mixing invalidates the lower order principle, i.e. the mixing of race invalidates ethnicity, then the mixing of families would invalidate the person. This, however, is untrue. As stated before, the person, or individual, is an invalid locus of social analysis because holistic group or category is always prior, and the person is analytically subsumed into the group. Without the group or nexus of relations, the reproduction of persons is impossible. Analysis restricted to the personal level renders unclear the reproduction of persons and the maintenance of the social tie, which is the fundamental basis for society as a whole. Individualist analysis fails to recognize the other. As such, any true analysis of personal behavior must proceed in a holistic manner in order to properly describe social behavior and topology. Much modern political analysis, both rightist and leftist, is foundational on an individualist, psychologistic methodology which obscures the actual social life of persons, because, as has been mentioned, it is the group that enables and is the basis for social and political life, not the individual. Examples of this can be readily discerned. People vote more or less as a racial bloc, church congregations are naturally racially segregated, and between 30 to 60% of variation in political views is heritable. Several studies, such as those by Philippe Rushton, have also shown that humans have natural in-group preference. It is clear that man is a social animal that prefers others like himself, and thus that the modern lens of indiscriminate individualism as a mode for analyzing behavior is flawed. The evolution of the human species has proceeded forth by means of group selection, and it is therefore the group which determines the modalities of human behavior rather than the individual and his psychology. Only in a purely individualist society, such as that which the forces of liberalism and the left are presently seeking to establish, could we speak of psychology as having a decisive or dominant role in behavior. Omniparticularity is vital in the preservation of the autonomy of groups, which is also to say the autonomy and freedom of persons. Groups of heterogeneous ethnicity and race cannot have a general interest in will due to natural differences between the behaviors and needs of those groups, and thus they come into conflict due to a difference of ends. The concept of the general will in democracy elucidates the fundamental problem, which is that a schism in the will of the group leads to the tyrannization of those in the group whose ends are, for political reasons, left unrealized. A mixed group consisting of both Jews and Arabs, for example, cannot attain the ends of either respective group because the ends are determined by totalizing religious systems. There is only one sacred location, i.e., the place of the Third Temple, and the construction of either a Jewish temple or an Islamic mosque frustrates the ends of either group. Likewise, joint possession of the Holy Land stands against the religious destiny of either group. It is full possession which is prophesized, not democratic pluralism. Leaving the problem of religion aside, it is also clear that differences in the basic characteristics and tendencies of groups make pluralism prone to failure. As has already been noted, races vote in blocks, and so the political ends of two or more races cannot be realized simultaneously. Moreover, the cultural ends of the two respective groups remain mutually exclusive. Two systems of collective symbols, originary myths, or ways of life cannot coexist. The industrialized, scientific modality of Europeans is antithetical to the ways of life of indigenous non-Europeans. It is impossible to, in the same territory, exploit and dominate nature whilst living in harmony with it. One could argue that such coexistence is possible if one or the other group were to undergo a cultural transformation, abandoning its way of life in favor of one compatible with the other, but such transformations are rarely consensual and constitute a serious break with their historical legacies. Ordinarily, such transformations are considered colonial, since to adopt the ways of life of other peoples is at once to either carry out an appropriation and also to introduce to one's group a foreign element, or to be the victim of erasure and domination. In any case, transformations of this kind will most likely be the hegemonic effort of a small group of intellectuals and activists rather than a genuinely collective affair. If it is a question of returning to the original ways of life of Europeans, then the problem of conflict over totalizing cultural symbology remains. The paganism of the Vikings and that of the Goths cannot, in truth, go together. Then we must speak of the problem of pluralism. To honor one's people by erecting monuments instantiates within society a valorization of that way of life which cannot be commensurate with that of another. The effort to remove, destroy, or deface statues that represent the European legacy in pluralistic countries like Australia and the United States is emblematic of this fact. Pluralism effectively constitutes a delegitimization of the culture and existence of the majority group, or it takes the form of colonialism and imperialism, making the inevitably hegemonic outcome of pluralism more visible. Pluralism is a mask for hegemony. All empires have been based on this principle. It is necessary, then, to preserve the integrity of groups in order to grant to them the proper autonomy. Autonomy, however, does not mean simply negative freedom. The classical definition of freedom meant belonging to a group. To belong to a group is to exist in a space in which one's capacity for action is enabled. It is a form of positive freedom. The individualist, negative freedom of liberal states, conversely, tends to lead to conditions in which one sphere of activity is truncated by others, whether this be in the economic sphere by means of the actions of the bourgeoisie, or in the social sphere by means of the conflicts endemic to pluralism. Negative freedom is not freedom at all, but rather it is an open space for the commencement of hegemonic actions. By defining freedom in terms of a lack of prohibition, it produces a condition in which there remains a broad range of unenumerated acts of domination, such as the displacement of communities and ethnic groups, or the monopolistic enclosure and domination of economic spheres. Negative freedom leads directly to global socioeconomic monopoly, in other words, toward empire. Positive freedom, on the other hand, imposes a condition of limits which renders impossible the globalization of ancestry and capital. All political orders are the formalization into law of socially determined obligations people emergently have to one another. These obligations form as a result of pre-existing familial and social bonds, such as that between parent and child, or between one and another family living in a community. The principle of omniparticularity is thus also a principle of close mutuality. Because persons are relying upon a whole hierarchical nexus of social principles for their existence, they have a duty to assist each other according to the order of charity. This order of charity is exclusive rather than inclusive, as race, which is the highest level of categorical identity, has no prior differentiating principle upon which a common set of human obligations might rest. Ancestry is the higher order principle of race, but it is impossible to identify in the abstract with ancestry. To identify with one's ancestry means to identify, above all, with one's race. As such, the question of having a duty to humanity is irrelevant. To speak of humanity is to speak of divisions, as humanity is simply a reification of the real diversity of human persons into an artificial abstraction to which one cannot have any social relation. As such, the order of charity does not extend beyond the race. The duty to lend support to the common social pool remains within the categories of omniparticularity. The universalist ideal in which each man, as an individual, is expected to support those outside of one's highest categorical identity in order to compensate either for their natural differences, like egalitarianism, or to compensate for alleged social wrongs, anti-racism, stands in contradiction to the principle of diversity. One cannot celebrate diversity, nor support others on the basis of diversity, if it is given that one is inherently equal to others and has no prior bonds or obligations to others except the presumption of shared individuality. The concept of humanity, like pluralism, must be conceived in a different light than it usually receives. Generally, it is utilized in a liberationist context. The French Declaration of the Rights of Man aimed to accomplish liberty, fraternity, and equality for the human race. The internationalism of Marxism, along with the anti-racism which has relatively recently been affixed to that philosophy, aims at liberating all of mankind, regardless of color or creed, from the shackles of bourgeois domination. Analysts, for this reason, rarely consider humanity to be an attendant tool of domination. The main reason lies perhaps in that such efforts are only in their incipient phase, and those who decry them are largely relegated, or do in fact actually run in circles of conspiracy theorizing. Nonetheless, there are objective examples of domination put in practice by globalist or multilateral institutions whose raison d'etre is apparently the service of humanity and world peace. The least controversial example is that of the International Monetary Fund, which regularly meddles in the economies of impoverished third world nations in an effort to neoliberalize them. The primary means by which it achieves this is through rendering member countries dependent upon loans, which they frequently are unable to repay. When these countries default, as Mexico did in 1982, they are required by the IMF to restructure their economies and to reorient their political structures in a pro-American direction. Such a relationship of indebted dependency empowers creditors at the expense of national sovereignty, further granting control over these countries to the Atlanticist sphere. The World Bank performs a similar task, lending to countries and requiring them to adhere to structural adjustment programs, which require debtors to liberalize their economic structures. In theory, third world member nations have a voice in the process as well as the content of structural adjustment programs. However, first world nations have an overwhelming majority in the vote. For all practical purposes, these multilateral organizations are unilateral. Other globalist organizations serve similar purposes, reinforcing Western Atlanticist hegemony over the nations of the East and Global South. They also exercise power against first world nations, which was particularly relevant during the 2014 migrant crisis. The UN funds various refugee programs, determines the rules for asylum seekers, which require host countries to allow foreigners to cross borders and temporarily reside there while they seek asylum. Practically, refugees are granted carte blanche to infiltrate and overstay, as liberal governments scramble to grant them amnesty. Likewise, other such organizations exist whose express purpose is to homogenize humanity. The World Faith Initiative aims to produce a single, syncretic faith comprised of the world's major religions, thus diluting and rendering non-integral their contents, whilst opening up the relevant countries to an inflow of foreigners who, now following a single world religion, are assimilable. It need not be said that such an effort is a form of cultural erasure and colonialism. Without recourse to the theory that such multilateral and globalist organizations are attempting to produce a world government, there is enough evidence alone to suggest that their raison d'etre is not the liberation of humanity nor the accomplishment of world peace. Rather, they exist to dominate in the interests of the world's primary hegemon, the United States. To speak of humanity as one organism is implicitly to argue that it must have a single head and that it must act essentially in concert. Differences in needs, abilities, wants, culture, even race are disallowed for the simple reason that these serve as a source of dissonance in the grand symphony. To unify humanity is, in truth, to destroy humanity, to render it a mass of indistinct flesh, mutable for any purpose. This symphony is, in the final analysis, only noise. The very act of development, which underlies the efforts of various committees and organizations of the UN, interferes with the cultural feelings of a great many peoples. Western technological prowess, instrumental reason, the drive to innovate and grow, in a word, the Faustian spirit, is being foisted upon indigenous peoples who would rather live in harmony with the land. These organizations will not stop until all of humanity approaches the singularity of techno-capital, liberated for the sake of production and consumption. They escape the prison of nature and lack, only to find the prison of society and abundance, where their personality is stamped out forever under a sea of impersonal, contractual relationships. The motive behind omniparticularity is simple. Human societies must serve humans as they are, not as we wish them to be. The motion of progress heretofore and always is the elimination of impediments to liberation in service of a fetishized, abstract goal which cannot be realized. For the liberals, it was liberty. For the neo-capitalists of today, it is abundance or development. All the limits, safeguards, hierarchies, and structures that had previously granted to men a stretch of autonomy fall away in favor of yet another form of slavery, slavery to appetite, which is to say privation. Capitalism, as Adam Smith said explicitly, is foundational upon the existence of an insatiable appetite. In pursuit of such, the bourgeoisie finance growth with debt, which culminates in the collapse of such an irrational system. Communism is foundational on an unceasing desire for liberation, which, when it is finally accomplished, consumes itself, presenting yet another need for liberation. Contrary to the belief present in both ideologies, neither system is natural. In a vacuum, the security of the group is always paramount. States organized from and for groups. Individualist liberation, whether it be capitalist or socialist, will never arise organically, least of all because such liberation is asymptotic and thus, in the final analysis, socially self-defeating because unsatisfying. The globalization of culture and economy carries with it a grave fault line, namely that of universal collapse, which is to say, transformation. Universal systems fail universally, such that the failure of any given part must spread like a contagion to all the other parts. A globalized economy, under a stock market failure, will be sent reeling, plunging the world into another Great Depression. Cultural decadence, which means the dissolution of the original cultural feeling that inspired a given system or nation, will spread globally. The ubiquity of American consumer culture in even third world countries is evidence of this fact, as well as the mass revolt of the youth against the capitalist system by, as is said in China, laying flat, eschewing the bourgeois and proletarian responsibilities upheld morally by the previous generations. Such decadence is not a cause for reaction, however. It is simply a sign that the current irrational system is wearing itself thin, that a transformative collapse is on the horizon. The general strike of Sorel may be finally realized by the simple non-participation of the coming generations in the economic life, a true revolt against the modern condition of the materialization of life and spirit. Impassivity in the face of the Faustian mania, the latter being what Evola called the bite of the tarantula, is a true and effective act of resistance according to the degree to which it becomes universal. The bourgeoisie, as well as members of the deluded proletariat, have heretofore frequently decried that the youth don't want to work. This is a mirage originating from the despondency that arises from unsatisfied self-interest, but perhaps in the future it will not be so. A capitalism that does not produce cannot survive, and thus the system of global homogenization will come to an end. The ultimate logic of self-interest, which is consumption without production, will finally be realized, and will most likely result in a wave of reaction. This reaction must also be resisted. To fall back upon the capitalist system is to lose what has been accomplished. Instead, men of the right must push forward and demand a complete reorganization of production along the lines of a rarefied and rejuvenated bourgeoisie, which is held under thumb by a paternalistic autocrat such that they do not fall again to their excesses. It is necessary that every class contributes toward the success and sustenance of the whole. Such can be accomplished through a radical revolution in values and power. Revolution from above. The prevailing notion of revolution consists in an upheaval or overturning of an existing order, closely related to some process of progress. Various writers have taken this notion to its logical conclusion, particularly the Frankfurt School, which conceived of a dialectics of negation which, unlike Hegel's dialectics, has no endpoint since it is a process of continually negating what exists. Marcuse argued that such a way of thinking would lead to a permanent revolution, or in other words, a revolution which continually subverts itself. Revolution, understood as a rotation, certainly matches up with this conception. Julius Evola, however, conceived of a different definition of revolution, the return to a point of origin. This idea, however, must be extricated from its reactionary context. More generally, a revolution in this sense isn't merely an atavism or a return, but rather the very recognition of the origins of things and peoples. To return to our origins is to say that we must be, against the universalizing spirit of modernity, aware of our roots and particularities, and the origin of these roots in the divine. The self-existent individual, without qualities, without race, without character, even without body, is an entity without origin. The contingent person, conversely, has a definite beginning. Under the symbol of roots, the person has his existence only through his soul, which is created and nourished by God, and of which the body is its expression. In this sense, origin has a double meaning. It is both the noumenal and phenomenal basis for one's life, and owing to its antecedents to our life, it must be the organizing principle of all activity. As the traditionalist tirelessly refrained, modern man sees his roots and origin in the world below, in matter or material relations. It is, in fact, these relations which, according to Engels, create man and endow him with individuality. The consequence of this development has been the loss of the notion of origins, since material relations cannot in any serious way pre-exist men, and thus cannot be a point of origin. All Husserl's conception is that man is merely a bourgeois invention meant to hide these relations, and thus to render universal something that is in fact particular to classes, i.e. material interests, the class struggle. As such, he finds the principle of real men within what he calls the subjectless science of Marxism, by which he means primarily class warfare. Conversely, nothing that pertains to men can be subjectless. The science of Marxism is, in fact, developed and determined by the subject. All epistemes are creations of the subject, even the objective materialist one. Michel Foucault has quite exposed the arrogance of this orthodox Marxism by endeavoring on an archaeology of knowledge, which he accomplished partly in The Order of Things. Science has undergone a historically and subjectively conditioned transformation, beginning in the classical belief that resemblance denotes causation, and ending today in our positivism, in which testable correlations might imply causation instead. Marxism is simply another one of these systems of epistemology, the belief that thought, being, and action can be definitively deduced from economic relationships. It joins the ranks of all other epistemic systems which were thought to be absolute. The subject ultimately is not separable from actual concrete persons. The subject without qualities, the subject without a life, without a race, that belongs to only God. Men, on the other hand, are forced to be what they are, where they are. It is in these contexts, the possession of various indelible traits, that a true revolution must take place. René Guénon conceived of two complementary ontological principles, quality and quantity. Quality is related to what Aristotle called form, the intangible and differentiated blueprint for material objects. Quantity is related to matter, the undifferentiated substratum of objects. In the world, quality and quantity are fused, and nowhere will one find pure quality nor pure quantity. Pure quality would entail an immaterial existence. Pure quantity would entail utter indifferentiation. Societies, however, can trend toward either pole. Ancient and medieval society was characterized by the qualitative tendency. Religion took center stage in the social and political order. Profit was secondary to excellence and service. The economy was subordinated to the clerical and political. Modern society is characterized by the quantitative tendency. Secularism dominates. Profit has become the whole motive of our economic order, and the political is subordinate to the economic. The quantitative nature of modern society is reason for many of its ills. The notion of the individual is a conception of a human as a mere quantity, divorced from quality. From this entails atomization and a loss of roots in community, rendering null the social tie. The lust for profits originates from the conception that all value is reducible to a quantity, the universal equivalent, money. The notion of progress and the belief in the superiority of mass have their origins in the quantitative tendency as well. The revolution from above denotes precisely a societal reorientation in values away from quantity and toward quality. Of course, it could not be said that one is against quantity and for quality. Rather, it is a question of which pole predominates in society. Questions of quantity are inevitable in material existence. Despite the general tendency of the world toward decline, we can admit to various forms of material progress, and the economy is necessary for the provision of our bodily needs. However, such economy must be contextualized. It must be dominated by those with a view toward qualitative ends, such as the service of God, the service of concrete men, the crystallization of poetic and spiritual realities, and so forth. In other words, the classical notion of limits and moderation must be realized on the economic technical plane. Modern society is such that it is oriented around mass and scale. Men are rapidly outpacing the ability for the world to sustain them, and as the lust for profit intensifies, nations are being eradicated through the mass movement of peoples. To accomplish omniparticularity requires, among other things, the minimization of scale, the lightening of mass. People must be convinced that the so-called progress of capitalism and socialism, the abundance, the size, the weight, that it all has a negative character. The alienation that one experiences is ultimately the result of the primacy of labor and quantity in life, rather than being a product of simply how that labor is arranged. Men today harbor the most cynical views. They base their actions on self-interest, economic or power advantage, felicity, anything but principle. The time has come for a radical reorientation. People must learn to have values, to love others, to love God, and to abhor mass and spectacle. The quantitative tendency is anti-human. The writer which exemplifies this fact most is perhaps Nick Land, who predicts the emergence of a techno-capital singularity and an age of post-humans which, for him, has a positive character. If humans, in a sense, are their respective qualities, then the quantitative tendency is their demise. It becomes evident, then, no matter whether one believes in the primacy of humanity or in the value of concrete, particular humans, the civilization of quantity must be abolished. The quantitative democratic order must be abolished. In its place must be the qualitative aristocratic order. This is the meaning of the revolution from above. Formalization theory. The foundation of every state, without exception, is the formalization of pre-existing social relationships through law. The bonds persons and groups have with each other are the social cement of the state order, for which reason states seek generally to control, preserve, or modify the social ties so as to guarantee their own strength. There are three forms of formalization: family or group, individual, i.e. the social contract, and military. Family or group formalization corresponds to feudalism, classical democracy, and certain forms of monarchy. Individual formalization corresponds to liberal governments and certain forms of oligarchy, and military formalization corresponds to various kinds of autocracies, including fascism, the state socialism of the Soviet Union, as well as the People's Republic of China, etc. Under group formalization, the political structure of the state mirrors the structure of groups and is institutionalized along their relationships to each other. For example, the caste system delineates the responsibilities each group has to each other group. The sovereign itself is determined according to his paternal familial relationship, and as such, monarchies can be termed familial governments. Marxists have generally interpreted feudalism in purely material terms. They have cast it as a system that exists extractively, merely to exploit the labor of serfs or slaves for the benefit of lords under the weight of a religio-military ideology. Feudalism, however, is simply an emergence from the general social conditions that preceded it, as well as an extension of the kinds of bonds that persons perennially make with each other. As such, it was not an extractive society, but rather a bonds society. The conventional classification of feudalism as a reciprocal relation between its different castes is accurate. The way ancient Indians conceived of this was through the symbol of the body of Brahma. Each caste was associated in order of rank with his body parts, i.e., the peasants were his feet, producers his legs, and so forth. Feudalism did not aim to do anything, since its emergence was organic rather than constructed. It is perhaps the best picture of the perennial human society, what people tend to create without prior influence from ideological or philosophical systems. Furthermore, it was the freedom of allegiance and fealty which characterized the system more than its economic relations. Feudalism cannot be understood without reference to its complex and interpersonal series of ties which determined, in the final analysis, its structure and form. The relations between king and lords, relations between different noble families, relations between producers and their guilds, and so forth. Material analysis evades these relationships in favor of a determination based solely on the flow of goods and money, which in pre-modern societies always had a secondary importance to the personal and spiritual. Material analysis, when not contextualized as one of many possible approaches to political analysis, ends up as a modern arrogance, the monovariate fallacy. Individual formalization is typically contingent upon some type of social contract. The difficulty most have in understanding social contract theory illustrates the weakness of heretofore existing theories, which do not have at their center the notion of a social tie. Obviously, there is no physical extant contract that individuals sign under liberal democracies, and assent to government rule seems implicit rather than explicit, which is to say that it appears no such assent exists at all. Libertarian theories such as those of Bertrand de Jouvenel and Hans Hermann Hoppe conclude that the social contract is therefore invalid. However, such a conclusion is foundational upon a misunderstanding of the nature of social contracts. The social contract is simply a rationalization of the relationships individuals have to each other by which they come together to live in a particular social arrangement, i.e., a democratic state. These relationships include the norm against the initiation of force, the responsibility to care for individuals' security and later well-being through paying taxes, the duty to participate in democratic processes, as well as the requirement to adhere to the laws of the state, which in the final analysis are the apparent guarantor of individual autonomy and liberty. Those who act in such a way as to interrupt these relationships have effectively refused the social contract, for which reason those who violate laws are punished. Criminals often live in relative isolation from the rest of society, existing in their own communities imbued with their own nexus of social relationships. A liberal society with a large criminal underclass is effectively a dual society, in which part of the whole rejects the fundamental social tie between individuals. Thus, assent to the social contract is, ultimately, pro-sociality. The rational linkage of the individual to a system of laws constitutes this basic assent. Individualist formulations have a constructed character. The individual, as an autonomous and equal being, does not exist prior to liberal philosophy. Democracy in the classical world, as Alain de Benoit has written, was based upon group relations. To be endowed with the right to participate in a classical democracy, one must have been a citizen, and citizens were always members of a social group, i.e. the gentes. To be a citizen was also to be a member of an in-group. Classical democracy, then, more closely matches group formalization than does liberal democracy. It was the relation of the person to his group that counted, such that participation in the civic life was part of one's obligation to one's peers rather than his duty, if one even bothers to exercise it as an individual. Because the individual does not naturally nor concretely exist in terms of a subject shorn of all qualities and without relation to his actual existence, without a body, metaphorically speaking, he must be created. As such, the liberal society is, as Karl Popper wrote, an abstract society. All manner of insults against the person and his ties or identities are thus legitimate, and in the final analysis, he has no political reality. Individualist formalizations are primarily an extension of bourgeois interest in morality. Liberalism and its sacred, natural rights define a political unit which is most conducive to the existence of a market. The market actor, the individual, is the fundamental political unit precisely because the state exists to safeguard and facilitate that market. It is well known that the French Revolution was primarily a revolution by the bourgeoisie or third estate, which was prompted by increasing regulational load on market actors, such as an incline on the stringency of guild laws, higher taxation in both magnitude and number, as well as a growth in the Ancien regime's bureaucracy. It can be said that it was an anti-bureaucratic revolution above all, which elucidates the character of essentially liberal movements such as conservatism or American libertarianism. Military formalization is the most straightforward. All societies have need of mutual defense, for which reason they form militaries, which then become the substratum of the state. Such militaries must pre-exist the state apparatus in the beginning, because states can only be established with a condition of a territorial monopoly on force. The fundamental question, then, is whether the state is structured around that military, or whether the military remains a mere appendage of the state. Militaries are hierarchical because command structures are necessary for the proper implementation of strategy, as well as for the necessary power of command itself, without which no war could be carried out successfully. All states formalized around the military will be autocratic, as the structure of the state will mirror the structure of the command chain. This is the reason why, in such autocracies, the leader typically dresses himself in uniform and an array of various medals and honors. Military states tend to be revolutionary rather than reactionary, although there are exceptions. The outcome of revolutions from below is a military state, since it is easiest for revolutionaries to render civil a military structure rather than to engineer new institutions for the sake of whatever revolutionary ideology is behind the state. whatever bespoke ideological pretensions might underlie revolution. In practice, revolutions govern with the sword. Military states may shift into other states over time, as pre-existing social structures nevertheless continue to exist under militaries, which might form the basis of an alternative system. However, the communist effort to abolish the family and religion seriously damages the possibility of a return to group formalization, indicating that the state, rather than withering away, instead degenerates back into oligarchy, i.e., the individualistic relationship. Formalization theory demystifies the remarkably non-communist structure of state socialism. The formation of the Soviet state consisted, in the beginning, of mutinies from soldiers against the Tsarist commanding officers. Bolshevik propaganda was spread at the front, and the Bolsheviks themselves prevaricated somewhat regarding whether the war was legitimate, i.e., an aid to revolutionary aims. Nonetheless, the USSR was forged in the flames of militarism. Lenin adapted in straightforward fashion the structure and personnel of the Tsarist army. The leader of the USSR was ultimately its supreme commander, as is typically the case in modern states. The classical duality of Rex-Dukes was not present, and the USSR appeared as an entity which confronted the world as if it were in a constant state of war. A Dukes in such a case would have been redundant. Much of the industrial advancement of the USSR was geared towards supplying the military with arms and its soldiers with supplies. As has already been said, the leaders of the USSR always dressed in military uniform, and the means by which Stalin carried out collectivization was military in fashion. In Ukraine, he created units from both soldiers and certain Ukrainians themselves to confiscate grain and property from peasants, known as kulaks. These acts were referred to as war communism, which reveals the essentially militaristic nature and structure of the USSR. Those revisionist Marxists who defend the USSR will frequently argue, in response to criticism of the USSR by other Marxists, that the non-communist nature of the state was simply the result of the need for socialism to defend itself against capitalist states. Again, the state has enemies, and a strong military must be sustained and built to combat them. As one might expect, the Soviet Union was imperialistic and expansionist, which is not so much an extension of the internationalism as it was a consequence of the nature of military formalization. A state which forms with the military as its basis must find use for that military, otherwise it will exist essentially without justification, and thus the state would lose the greater part of its legitimacy. It is self-evident that the USSR was not a proletarian state. The means of production were seized by the state and controlled by the state's elite, who set themselves apart from the proletariat itself. What democracy did exist was inconsequential and frequently ignored. The USSR's 1936 constitution promised universal suffrage through secret ballots, as well as various rights such as freedom of speech and assembly. Obviously, none of these rights were seriously defended by the party leadership. The workers' Soviets had little actual influence over events. Rather, most matters political and economic were the responsibility of the party bureaucracy. If the Soviet Union were genuinely a proletarian state, then any sort of formalization in regard to production would not have been necessary. Matters would have been decided democratically within communes. Several have attempted to discern the true locus of power in the Soviet system. The claim that the state, like other totalitarian dictatorships, existed to empower the leadership is banal. All states exist to empower the leadership. The merely implicit existence of classes does not permit class analysis, and the non-existence of proletarian rule makes impossible the declaration that the Soviet Union was a proletarian state. The only political unit which had any special attention and power was the military. We can therefore discern that the Soviet Union was a military formalization. Lastly, it must be noted that anarcho-capitalist notions of private law seem to militate against this theory by way of proposing that formalization does not necessarily end in a state. However, such arguments are rebutted by the centripetal tendency of law in general. Law based upon stare decisis gradually accumulates in the regular course of proceedings a homogeneous body of rule which unites what previously had been only loosely connected and non-federated communities. These laws must be enforced, and if a single jurisprudence characterizes these communities, then enforcement becomes united as well. Thus, private law results in a territorial monopoly on force, Max Weber's definition of the state. Other forms of jurisprudence will suffer the same fate, as demand for fairness, consistency, and equity will unify fragmented jurisdictions until they fall under a single code. In the final analysis, as Robert Nozick has noted, anarcho-capitalism formalizes into a critarchy. States are not built ex nihilo. All states require an institutional substratum upon which human relationships are organized. The failure of Marxism to produce a genuine socialism, by which I mean worker ownership over the means of production, originates in the problem that such worker collectivities do not meaningfully exist. The effort to construct them is thus carried out under the context of a military hierarchy, which remains the primary relationship the worker has to the state, as the producer of the substratum of military strength. Workers are related to other workers only insomuch as their relationships are modulated and produced by the state itself, i.e. war communism. For which reason the state does not wither away because it cannot wither away. There is a symbiotic relationship between worker collectivities and the central command of the state, since the former does not exist without the latter. Because the construction of a state is foundational upon the pre-existence of social institutions, it can only ever be oriented around those institutions. In a vacuum, the three types of formalization will continually birth themselves depending on the state of the people in question, for which reason the collapse of a state will never produce communism. Individualistic formalization leads to a general condition of atomization, the collapse of group sociality, and the withdrawal inward of relationships with others into relationships of things with oneself. The means through which this occurs is primarily the rendering obsolete of the importance of ties with social groups, which become replaced instead by ties with individuals, such as the relationship between the employer and employee, the exchange of market actors with one another, the forging of contracts, as well as the anonymous relationships that frequently occur in online spaces. The family, ultimately, is simply a survival which, because of its primordiality, is difficult to repress. Additionally, the family serves such an important role in the reproduction of labor, literacy, and ideology that it cannot be dispensed with under any system. Due to the dispersed nature of the social tie, as well as the obscuration of sovereignty, individual formalization leads to societies governed by a positive law. Group formalization generally relies on custom, as well as a more flexible system of laws which, later, as the system degenerated, became the prerogative of the absolute sovereign to overrule or decree. Since individuals, lacking in relation to an overarching and continuous social order, cannot rely on custom and self-enforcement to determine the limits of action, it is necessary to construct the rule of law, a polite fiction which exists only so long as the relevant parties agree to submit to it. Thus, the implicitly contractual nature of individualist formalization is exposed. It is trusted that, if one party violates the rule of law, then another party will act to rectify that violation, thus upholding the principle generally. However, it can happen that laws are enforced selectively or unilaterally in such a way that is consonant with the general moral outlook of the regime, in which case the violation of the rule of law goes unpunished. Such is the weakness of individual formalization. The state, having become completely formalized, constitutes an elaborate forest of potential actions and counter-reactions, which becomes impossible to consistently navigate. Federal tax audits serve as a ready example. Often these are unevenly applied to regime enemies in order to either chill their political action or to expose the inevitable missteps they may have committed, thus rendering them politically forceless. Group formalizations are less likely to fail to enforce law fairly. Much law remains customary, and as such, it is the relevant groups who follow such customs who can apply such laws and standards in order to justify their actions and counter-reactions. A good example is the right of reprisal, which was relatively common in pre-modern law. A party was not compelled to follow a decree or law that was deemed, according to custom, to be unjust. In fact, one could even rebel against the authority who issued such decree or law legitimately. In such a way, certain rulers were overthrown, while maintaining in the process the basic structure, customs, and principles of the political order. In this way, monarchs were tied down by the strictures of law much more tightly than the sovereign, whoever he may be, under individual formalization. Military formalization is a special case because such organizations follow the leader principle, Führerprinzip. Law, thusly, is merely a framework for the delegated enforcement of social order by organs and units beneath the sovereign. The sovereign, however, can act as he wishes, even in contravention to the law. Such an arrangement may be expressed by the term democracy, in the sense that the leader, as the personification of the people's will, can act without barriers. Law then simply becomes an execution of the leader's will, rather than the force or framework that constrains him. There remains the question of how the prerequisites for formalization themselves form, as well as what process leads to the formalization of the state itself. The former is a question of historical specificity. Groups form along the lines of tribal organization, which then become clans. Lewis Morgan detailed this process excellently. Individual formalizations are the result of legitimated philosophical inventions, which in this case are those which began after Descartes and continued on with Hobbes in the beginnings of English liberalism and the Magna Carta. Prefigurations of the individualist idea can be found in classical oligarchies, however. Lastly, the formation of militaries is complex and, like groups, also historically specific. Typically, they arise out of an emergent need for defense or offense. The militias of the American Revolutionary War are one such example, even if they did not ultimately lead to a specifically military formalization. The military of the Tsar could be said to have originated from groups, but which led, after the revolution, to a military formalization. Formalization itself occurs when an auctor, or founder, organizes the relations on which a state will be built. Bertrand de Jouvenel elaborates on this concept in Sovereignty. The auctor is one who is capable of rousing men to action on account of their assent, which then leads to the relations that underlie the state which he creates. The auctor can be a single person, like Robespierre, but there can also be multiple auctors, such as the founding fathers of the United States. The necessary consequence of formalization theory is that a state which one wishes to be formed cannot exist unless the pre-existing points of condensation exist. For national monarchy, it is necessary first to have the existence of socially interrelated and interreliant groups that can serve as the substratum of the state order. Likewise, liberalism cannot prosper under states in which individuals still live in close tribal ties, such as in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and much of Africa. Military formalizations have the advantage that they can be implemented anywhere there is a serious, functioning military order. However, since they frequently arise without respect for the condition of the social tie, they tend to be weak and prone to internal revolution or civil war. This is why military formalizations must necessarily themselves take the form of a revolution, which involves the existence of an existential threat or enemy sufficient to galvanize and unite the requisite social groups, thus forming out of nothing a strong social tie. In such cases that there is an ideological enemy, it can be said to be ever present, upon which basis the Soviet Union, Maoist China, and North Korea have carried out their respective revolutions. Non-formalization theories tend to either reify the state as a thing in itself or cast it as an arbitrary hierarchy imposed by power actors for their own exclusive benefit. Neither conclusion is correct. As Bertrand de Jouvenel has noted, states are comprised of multiple institutional centers which interact with one another. Groups, such as families or ethnicities, interact with power centers and loci of economies. Individuals interact with instruments of law and institutions of power, voting. Militaries interact with civic populations and institutions, such as command structures and the polity more generally. States are not arbitrary, for they are the necessary crystallization of pre-existing social structures and relationships into a form that has legitimacy and permanence, which enables the cooperation of the parts in a single whole. As such, their creation necessitates both an action from above as well as a certain configuration from below. Idealist theories of state which suppose that it has an absolute conceptual existence, Hegel, Gentile, Avila, obscure that unity within a state is the sum of its relationships, not a given fact. Group formalizations can only exist to the extent that the groups within the state assent to its existence or present configuration. The right of reprisal, for example, enables constituent groups within the state the opportunity to either reform the state order or to abolish it entirely in favor of their local authority. When populations come to be ruled by foreigners, or when the racial or ethnic substratum that underlies group identity becomes corrupted through commingling, group formalizations can become unstable. Individualist formalizations can fail when the individual, its universalist roots having been withered away by the rise of group identity, such as ethnic or racial consciousness, ceases to be the fundamental unit of social life. Military hierarchies can fail when they are defeated in war and thus lose legitimacy, or when the civil authority takes power over the military apparatus. An absolute state seems on first analysis to be invincible. In reality, however, no state is absolute. Group formalizations tend to rise emergently. The formation of feudal states occurred when conquering warlords acquired territories and the people within, and then brought them under subjection. From the warrior clan, a nobility arose which would then become the rulers of the kingdom. A central characteristic of the group formalization is its organic character. Each group finds its place in the state according to its purpose and its relation with other groups. The caste system did not arise out of ideology, but instead out of political and material relations. Liberal states, on the other hand, had to construct the mass market by way of also constructing the individual, whose role is primarily as a producer and consumer. In the modern context, a truly emergent state is an impossibility. Clans no longer exist. Those groups which would ordinarily form the prefiguration of the formalization have been atomized by the action of liberalism. To establish a group state would require the re-emergence of group social ties, which must be facilitated by deliberate action both from above and below. Above, all obstacles to the creation of strong and local social ties must be abolished, such as positive or human rights, prohibitions against discrimination, liberal democracy, and the various state supports of the mass market, i.e. material relations must be recontextualized and the market delimited to localities. From below, racial and originary consciousness must be awakened, the bourgeois family must be abolished, and there must be a complete revolution in values away from those of the bourgeoisie in favor of those characteristic of an aristocracy. To build a group formalization requires, in the first instance, that one establishes the groups that will form the substratum and structure of the state. Ordinarily, political movements operate on the basis of the party, which prefigures the democratic nature of modern states, whether they are liberal or illiberal, i.e. dictatorial. Naturally, the group state requires a different form of organization. Initially, this must consist in the formation of an order of people who share certain values and qualities, a certain magnanimity, hostility to the liberal order and the values of bourgeois modernity, a preference for the qualitative over the quantitative, and inflexibility of principles, in short, nobility. This group would then become the basis for electing or appointing a prefiguration of the nobility itself from among its members. Then, the nobility would engage in the task of recruiting subordinates and acquiring the requisite resources to accomplish political endeavors, such as campaigning and elections. Unlike the party, this process, after its initial phase, is completely undemocratic. The mere act of establishing such an organization alters power discourse in such a way as to create the possibility of replacing the democratic system in favor of an aristocracy through the process of elections. No longer will discourse be carried out in terms of popular parties, the will of the people, popular sovereignty, and other such illusions. At most, it will amount to the democratic order's elective self-dissolution. In this way, a group formalization can be accomplished through pragmatically democratic means without severely damaging nor diluting the basis for that formalization itself. In the final analysis, it appears that politics is not impossible, assuming that one endeavors to redefine what constitutes a party in the democratic system, something for which there are typically few or no formal rules, only conventions. After such a political victory, then the structure of this organization can be transposed onto the state itself. Lords can be assigned their respective regions, the military can be split up, and regional units created and then put under their command. Liberal structures, laws, and institutions can be abolished, and the long task of cultivating discrete communities and groups, as well as the creation or formalization of the nation, can begin. The question can be raised, however, whether such a formalization can really constitute an aristocracy. Historical aristocracies have always arisen as a result of emergent activity, and the sovereign of such aristocracies has always proven his own valor in the process of conquering. From that point on, procession of rule was hereditary, solving the question of continuity. We can, however, reduce conquest to a selective mechanism which might be replaced with alternative constructions. It was also historically somewhat common to elect a monarch when it was not clear who should ascend to the throne. Such elections always took place among the nobility, so in the initial instance, it is necessary to first form a nobility. Nobility, however, suffers from the same problem of origins as the sovereign himself. Hitherto, the nobility was selected on account of their success in war and their status within the clan. Absent such wars and absent clans, a nobility must be selected by an auctor or founder who will determine the character of the group formalization in the first place and who acquires his position as a consequence of having the initiative to form the group in the first place. Whether or not this auctor should become the sovereign is a question of happenstance. He may be gentle, he may be only philosophical, or merely a man of great initiative. Whatever the case, the question can be resolved in situ. There remains also the possibility of drawing an aristocracy from the military. However, such nobles may very well be deficient in values and thoroughly bourgeois. Nothing must be said, of course, of the possibility of drawing the nobility from the richest or the most powerful of the bourgeoisie. Ultimately, formalization theory enables the possibility of political change by way of imitation. By prefiguring the desired political order, it is possible to accomplish it given the exercise of a certain pragmatism, the acquisition of capital, the garnering of popular support, and a revolution in values. Further, it elucidates the real raison d'etre of the state, the maintenance of the social tie and social structures across time. Materialist theories of state, i.e., anarchism, Marxism, misconceive of the purpose of the state, namely that it exists in a purely extractive and dominative manner. Conversely, states exist and can only exist out of the assent to the initial act of the founding of a state by an auctor who defines its purpose and values. This form of power, distinct from coercion, underlies all states and only becomes obscured as states degenerate, i.e., diverge from their original intended purpose, which was the object of the original assent. Nonetheless, coercion is inextricable from the concept and purpose of the state. The maintenance of the social tie requires the diminishing of all those units which upset the basis for formalization, as well as those forces which violate the laws and customs of those formalized states. Elite theory as anti-theory. A theory of state formation is not complete without a view toward the nature and operation of power within an established state, which simultaneously is a theory, either implicitly or explicitly, of political change. Marx conceived of the question in terms of class power. Feudal states were ruled by the nobility, who were the primary recipients of economic production. Capitalist states are ruled by the bourgeoisie, who likewise have the prerogative to profits. Socialist states are ruled by the proletariat, who as a whole are entitled to social output. Political change is the result of evolution in material relations, which leads to the domination of certain classes against others, posing a contradiction in the Hegelian sense. These contradictions eventually consummate in the next phase. The feudal mode of production headed by the nobility becomes eclipsed by the capitalist mode of production headed by owners of capital. Eventually, the conflict between workers and capitalists produces a classless society, communism. As such, Marx concluded that class war was the motor of history, and as such, all political change could be reduced to a consequence of changes in material relations. Dialectical materialism has limits. Despite the growing lateness of capitalism, class war has not broken out nor led to any meaningful revolutionary fervor, with the exception of the outbreak of syndicalism before the First World War. Marx did not anticipate that the reactionary measures of bourgeois democracies, which have fused certain socialist aims with the market, could be successful in thwarting class consciousness, let alone that class consciousness might never arise, owing to a limitation on the extent of the immiseration of the proletariat. As such, Lenin had to revise Marx's theory, supposing instead that socialism could be accomplished elsewhere than in developed capitalist states, and also that class consciousness could only be raised by a vanguard, therefore not arising as a result of material relations themselves. The development of vanguardism marks a significant shift in political thought, away from spontaneous populism toward political patriotism. The writers of the Italian elite school, Michels, Mosca, and Pareto, have delineated a theory of power which seems to explain, also, the reason for Marx's lack of success. Mosca, rather than situating economic classes at the head of states, rather conceived of an entirely new class of persons, the ruling class. As he states, all majorities are always ruled by minorities. The possibility of a genuinely populist state of the kind Lenin was attempting to build, through his lens, seems impossible. The ruling class is always specialized, and because specialized, self-interested. It will operate purely according to raison d'etat. It will primarily be concerned with the self-perpetuation of the elite and thus of the state. Pareto dispensed with material analysis and instead supposed that political change is driven by psychological factors. Political beliefs are simply extensions of certain psychological traits or residues, and political ideologies or systems are merely the derivations of said residues. As such, socialism is merely an extension of a human desire for combination or collectivity than it is the accomplishment of a definite political or economic system, which in the final analysis would be impossible. Michels exposited his famous concept of the iron law of oligarchy. Any state based upon the party system will always come to be ruled by a few elite men owing to a few reasons. 1. Party leaders become indispensable to the functioning of the party, and as such, cannot be deposed nor replaced. 2. Elites serve specialized functions. 3. Delegation of party members by elites secures their dominant position. For these reasons, socialist states never wither away and instead remain authoritarian bureaucracies, thus invalidating Marxist schema. In recent years, attempts have been made on the right to synthesize the Italian elite school into a coherent and unified form of power analysis, which includes also the French writer Bertrand de Jouvenel. The aim is to oppose and serve as an alternative to the Marxist conception of class war, facilitating both forms of reaction as well as potentially forms of revolution. This attempt, however, can only accomplish the former because these theorists were generally reactionary in outlook, with the exception of Michel's, who at the time he had written Political Parties was still a Marxist. Elite theory is an anti-theory precisely because of its reactionary nature. It merely aims to describe power rather than to instruct one on how to soften or change it. Certain negative imperatives are implied by elite theory, such as the conclusion of the impossibility of populism or bottom-up revolutionary strategies, the inefficacy of leaderless movements, and the forlorn prospects for anarchism to remain horizontal. These may be all well and good, however, one will find it difficult, if not impossible, to extract a positive imperative from these writings. Elite theory aims to divorce theory from praxis. The Frankfurt School, which aimed affirmatively at accomplishing revolutionary change, concluded accurately that praxis and theory form a unity. The praxis of elite theory is the maintenance of power. Conversely, the praxis of the Frankfurt School's critical theory is the overturning of power. Such is the strength of the left. If the right wishes to accomplish its goals, then it must choose a theory with a suitably revolutionary praxis. Frequently, exponents of elite theory conclude that nothing can possibly be done to power from outside power. Bertrand de Jouvenel's schema of the center and periphery is illustrative. The center consists of the elite, which possesses and wields power. The periphery, which consists of the ruled masses, is powerless and basically ineffective. One must conclude, therefrom, that power is invincible unless it decays from the inside, such as from decadence or a threat from another equal if not superior power. Here we can discern clearly a species of fetishism, power fetishism. Power is not a force or the power of command, but rather it is a relationship or a series of relationships. And because it is a relationship, it can be affected from both ends, from above and also from below. Thus, power is a game, and its rules are defined by its players. Michel Foucault discerns more clearly how power actually operates in states. Power has a coercive element, which is generally what the elite theorists are concerned with. However, that coercive power is supported by a whole complex of values, moral imperatives, material incentives, and complexes of information. Authoritarian states cannot function without some means of ascertaining the conditions and behaviors of subject populations. Forces of police or soldiers will not obey commands without the influence of a political and moral ideology. The execution of commands cannot be carried out without the cooperation of various elements of society, as if the KGB could operate without a whole nexus of informants and snitches who would reveal dissidents and petlierists. Such a system of authoritarian control is, however, somewhat dated. Foucault outlined the course that power has taken throughout history, starting with capital punishment, describing the development of penal institutions, then ending with the modern system of supervision by various authorities within society, which he called the panopticon. The old system of police supervision and enforcement was inefficient and limited in scope, as well as prone to outbreaks of resistance. In its place, authorities realized they could better control, manage, supervise, even punish violations of laws and commands by distributing authority. Norms of health and sickness were created, insanity, uprightness and deviance, etc., which would be the basis for the exercise of guidance, discipline, and even social force by guardians such as physicians, psychiatrists, teachers, foremen, and employers. The deployment of moral norms against which one's behavior and beliefs was checked by one's peers accomplished also obedience to the state's demands. In such a way, the panopticon can endure much more resistance and rebellion than could the centralized, state-administered systems of the disciplinarian past, perhaps by preventing them entirely. Additionally, panopticism relies on a complex of relations which Foucault called infrapower, which consists in the small appropriations, scoldings, managements, etc. between members of the periphery. To carry out a revolution in the modern system, thus, is not a straightforward manner. The battleground of the 18th century was the street or the factory. Today, it is largely the mind. Penal systems function on the body. Panopticism and its infrapower functions mainly on the psyche through social modalities. For that reason, the revolution in modern liberal states must begin, perhaps even end, with a battle over discourse. Discourse encompasses the beliefs, attitudes, arguments, and principles of political subjects. What was innovative in Foucault's writings, however, was his conception of discourse as a power, as well as the notion of power as a game. Power is maintained not simply through coercion, but rather it relies heavily upon discourse to convince subjects that they ought to obey its commands and to refuse to violate its precepts or instructions. In liberal countries, the power discourse is entirely democratic and egalitarian. The people are sovereign under the law. One legitimately exercises his voice through voting. Politicians are his representative. All people are created equal and thus the elite are truly down at our level, etc. All this serves to throw up a reactionary mist which prevents people from conceiving of and establishing alternative systems. Within democracy, all rebellious and revolutionary energy is sublimated back into elections. The hunger that gnaws at the stomachs of all political radicals is sated rhythmically by the periodic victory of allied candidates from one's preferred party. If one does not prefer a party, then one can even vote for an independent or for the Greens, such that one can pretend, at least, to have a voice lent to his political conscience. To escape this sublimation requires foremost that one disperses this democratic mist. The only light which can do so is a profound shift in the discourse of power. When democracy is no longer legitimated by liberal discourse, then popularity for revolutionary forces can be accrued and then become actually effective. Entire masses of the disaffected will secede from democratic orders, either legitimately or illegitimately. There will cease being a sense of we as a homogeneous, egalitarian polity, and instead there will be an us as a distinct group of active particular men. All talk of popular sovereignty must be replaced with a concept of real paternal sovereignty derived from above. All claptrap about representatives must be replaced with the resolve to take matters into one's hands, to prefigure the order which one wishes to live under. Confidence in the power of bourgeois candidates to dissolve an unrighteous, irrational, and atomizing system must be replaced by the understanding that real change happens only when your concrete group wins. This talk of individuals ultimately must be subsumed in a flood of personality, the principle of having real relationships, loyalties, and bonds. Equality must be swapped with blood. Nation must be switched with nationalism. The effect of changes in discourse, accomplished metapolitically as well as politically, can be tremendous. One must only attempt it, to cast away all remnants of liberal thought and vocabulary, such as self-determination or rights. Elite theory throws up a veritable smokescreen. It has led men of the right to reckon that by lending support or by giving assent to the pre-existing bourgeois elite, that they can elevate their political ends to a higher efficacious status. However, such an act simply hands over to the bourgeois elite the right's manpower, which becomes unconsciously subservient to his ends. It could be said that the notion of the need for a patron or a vanguard to lead right-wing movements is high, that such leaders are indispensable. That much is true, but banal. If leaders are not cultivated from the same stock, interest, culture, and ideology as the movement, then they will fail to accomplish its ends in favor of alternative ends. Winning is cheap, but victory is expensive. Elite theory is not necessary to inform us of the necessity of leadership, organization, and structure. Need for such things has been consciously recognized at least since Lenin, and unconsciously recognized perennially. Again, something could be said for Pareto's circulation of the elite, but a fundamental problem with his conception is that to accomplish such circulation through official mechanisms can very well end merely with the new elite becoming a technician who carries out the tasks and duties of the system, thus ratifying its basic principles and aims. It is not a matter of simply becoming an elite, but rather prefiguring the desired system through the concerted efforts of a group. Modern politicians indeed are such technicians. Not one of them is in any real sense a leader of men. The leader has a vision, which requires both the requisite power necessary to accomplish it, as well as the existence of a political continuity. The democratic technician has neither. His political horizons are constrained by the ruling ideology, liberalism, the need to ingratiate himself with his elite peers, term limits which prohibit any sort of continuity. This thus forestalling long-term interventions, as well as the constraints of public opinion upon which he relies to be reelected. The existence of policy experts indicates that politicians are mere operators of the democratic machine who, in the final analysis, do not even get to determine what is right or ethical. Whatever is efficient is implemented according to the dictates of raison d'etat. Many speak of the ills of technocracy, aiming to distinguish it from democracy, but the reality is that all democracies are at their core technocracies. Men of values such as theologians, preachers, philosophers, these men never enter office because it is not a fruitful ground for them. Instead, those qualified are those schooled in law or business, even acting, as was the case with Ronald Reagan. Nobility is often charged with performativity, owing to their effete tastes, rigid customs, and refined manner, but it is, in fact, the technician who is performative. He pretends to be a leader. He promises to solve problems. He portends to his constituents and supporters that he does, in fact, have a vision, perhaps to make the country great again. However, once elected, it is clear how little he, as an agent, matters. He inherits all the problems of the great machine, as well as the clockwork people who manage it. All reforms simply entail slight modifications to its parts, which ultimately do not solve aforesaid problems. It might even become evident that there is a need to replace the machine, but often those who demand its replacement acquiesce either to its mere repainting or to its replacement by an alternative machine. Like everything in modernity, politics has become concretized, rote, routine, and fetishized. To entrust revolutionary ends to such a machine and its technicians is merely to jam it up for a time, after which point its other technicians will find ways to resume its operations. A truly revolutionary movement must put its trust in leaders from its own fold. One must have an organic group which can compete with those who are in the form of a party and which are fundamentally democratic in nature. One can, nonetheless, still engage with democracy. However, rather than from below, such engagement will be from above. The popular sentiment cannot be ignored, however. Power fetishism has a twin, elite fetishism. It consists in the belief that only the actions of the elite are relevant, that only the higher strata in any society can make effective action, that change can only pertain to that upper strata. It is self-evident, however, that the function of a state and its elite is the product of innumerable interconnections at the bottom. A serious disruption in these connections, or a concerted mass action meant to undermine the elite's power of command through damaging its legitimacy, is actually fundamental to any revolution. During the Russian Revolution, several mutinies broke out, strikes ensued, mass demonstrations flooded the square of St. Petersburg with disobedient people. These all served to undermine the provisional government's legitimacy. Previous outbreaks of bottom-up disobedience likewise prompted the Tsar's abdication during the February Revolution. In revolutionary France, the loss of legitimacy by the Ancien regime led to soldiers refusing to fight the revolutionaries. Elite theory would suppose that such events are either impossibilities or will not lead to any meaningful change in power. However, the historical record proves them wrong. The need is evident, then, for a holistic theory of political change. Revolutionary movements require leadership, and as has been said, must prefigure the order they wish to create. Metapolitics, which is the usage of messaging and networking outside of electoral politics, serves an indispensable role in the process of unraveling the illegitimacy of governments. Insofar as populist movements are concerned, theory is praxis. To take the side of the oppressed majority against the oppressor minority necessitates that one convinces that majority, as much as is possible, that the elites are in fact oppressors and thus are ruling illegitimately. The democratic route of populism has met its natural fate, captured by bourgeois politicians who simply reproduce the same elite-centric policies whilst utilizing the masses as manpower. The non-democratic metapolitical route would bear promising results. Populism, however, militates against the aristocratic spirit of national monarchism. It incites variations of class war that, ultimately, would render the creation of a right-wing movement impossible, for the concern with values will be swamped in a materialistic battle for bread. Right-wing populism is generally not that populistic, insofar as it coalesces around the capitalist mode of production and bourgeois forms of morality. The only effective mass movement for the right must be Volkish. It must originate in and for the blood. The organic collaboration toward which national monarchy aims can only be realized on the basis of a common racial identity. The monomaniacal obsession with the distinction between elite and proletarian can only concern a materialistic type for whom the possession of wealth is the only desideratum. We believe that there is more value in a man than his wealth. His character, his connections, his bonds, his group, these are his political expression. His wealth is only an accident. Until men can be convinced that the economic is peripheral and that the qualitative central, no distinct movement can be formed. The primary characteristic of modernity is its Faustian fixation on the quantitative. A true revolution worthy of our conception dispenses with that entirely. Thus, the left populist criticism that a Volkish movement obscures class relations, which are the real motor of history, is facile. The elimination of classes would not approach the true species being of man any more than would winning the lottery assuage a man of his melancholy. The central problem of modernity is that man has no roots and no sun, and thus his spirit tends to will. We aim to restore those roots to restore his spirit, from which he has been alienated by the demand to serve matter. In such a society, religion will take its rightful place as the integral tradition around which his life is oriented, and thus his sun will rise. The right to life or right to well-being can only concern the body, which socially democratic modernity already is now more than capable of sustaining, absent the smallest of revolutions. The spirit has, for too long, been neglected. It is the reinstantiation of an organic order which recognizes the variegated and unique qualities of man rather than merely his commonality of possessing metabolism from which to draw energy and hands from with which to work. To make a mass movement out of an aristocratic concept seems, superficially, to be a contradiction. However, inside every man, there is indeed an aristocrat, his spirit. The battle for national monarchy will be a battle not for liberation, bread, or freedom, but rather for the restoration of the natural place spirit has always had in society before the fateful convulsions of 1789. To say such is not to affirm reaction, rather, it is to point to a perennial fact which has, in modernity, been obscured. The spirit is not in the past, it is now. On that basis, a movement for the future can be built, which does not wish merely to dissolve or destroy, but instead to create and nourish the totality of the human organism in all of its various types. In this sense, even one who is born ignoble can aspire to bring about an aristocratic order in which surely he will have a valued place. If freedom means anything, then it means a species of its classical designation, to belong to a group, to an order, which enables one's sphere of activity, autonomy. The brotherly instinct in men has for too long been abused by liberals and socialists, sublimated to a universal abstraction, and then utilized to quash all life, particularity, and quality. We aim to restore the proper sense of brotherhood in the form of the actual concrete relations between members of particular groups. That is the sense in which a Volkish movement can be aristocratic. To stand for one's race is to stand for the divine mandate which nurtured and made it. The wish to be liberated is simply the wish to be atomized. The fascist question. Syncretic right-wing ideas always fall under attack by those who do not countenance the possibility of honestly understanding them. This occurs not just against writers such as Alain de Benoit or Julius Evola, but also against fascism itself, which is woefully misunderstood not just by demagogues, but also by academics. Perhaps this difficulty lies in the revolutionary nature of fascism, which goes ignored by critics and analysts in favor of a capitalist reactionary model based in a Leninist reading of dialectical materialism, in which an authoritarian dictatorship is the last defense of late capitalism. The question of the misunderstandings of fascism is a subject for another writing. Paul Gottfried published something of this sort. As for the syncretic ideas of the right, it must be said that they, the present one included, differ in numerous ways from the fascist idea, which will be the subject of the present chapter. The most often cited definition of fascism owes to Roger Griffin, who defines it as palingenetic ultranationalism. This definition is altogether too broad, since it can include within it everything from liberal paleoconservatism to the Volkish movement, as well as several nationalist movements that existed before fascism. This definition has been the basis for academic Tamir Bar-On to obliquely conclude that Alain de Benoit and the Nouvelle Droite is fascist, despite Benoit's differentialist anti-racism, his skepticism of biological categories, biologism, his third worldism, as well as his explicit support for classical forms of democracy. Given that much of the present work has been influenced by Benoit, it will surely come under attack for the same reasons. Italian fascism was inspired by the actual idealism of Giovanni Gentile, which posited that the world was the creation of the thinking spirit, or absolute subject, and that human individuals had their existence as a consequence of this subject. The state, moreover, was a creation by this subject, and so he derived that there was a unity of absolute subject, state, and the individual subject. This unity became the basis for the doctrine of fascism, which famously declared nothing outside of the state. From this originates the totalitarianism of the fascist state, its essential unity represented by the fasces, as well as its various appropriations of traditional Roman aesthetics and feelings. Fascism was created with attention to history, since history was the unfolding of the absolute subject in the world. Fascism aimed to be the embodiment of the spirit in history, and as such, it quickly became aligned with Marinetti's futurism. At first glance, the fusion of Roman style with the revolutionary modernist futurism seems contradictory. Umberto Eco could not understand this and concluded that fascism was simply irrational. However, the sense that there is a continuity and common source between the Roman past and the fast, violent future in the thinking spirit resolves the problem. It only paid homage to its past, which came from the spirit, and it was in the process of expressing its future, which came also from the spirit. The trouble of reconciling the king with this revolutionary movement, as well as with reconciling the Catholic Church, becomes apparent, since the revolutions having more or less suppressed Christianity was simply a consequence of the movement of this spirit. One could express this as Italy must be one, or it is nothing. To have a second, or even third center of power would have broken apart this unity. National monarchism, on the other hand, does not share the idealism of Gentile, but rather is based in more or less Aristotelian and Christian principles, but nevertheless can still be universalized, owing to its more or less modern methodology and construction. The basic premise of national monarchism is dualist rather than non-dualist. No unity of the human subject is deduced from the absolute subject. Human society is a creation by humans, which is carried out by our volition, though not divorced from providence. Our aim is to produce societies comprised of multiple, local, federated units which are freely moving and self-negotiated. As such, our project is very much the opposite of the totalitarianism of the fascists, which instrumentalizes culture, brutalizes persons, and transforms free sociality into a strict conformism. Moreover, fascism is essentially materially and culturally progressive rather than reactionary. National monarchy is neither. It seeks to preserve the qualitative aspects of human life against the raging currents of the modern mercantile and proletarian mentality, but without the performative illusion that a return to the past is possible. It is, if we may express it, presentist. We seek the full embodiment of the qualities, feelings, culture, and roots of the present, which implies also a sense of the continuity of time. To be reactionary is simply to defend what is, or to wish to create a performance of the past in the present. National monarchy, conversely, wishes simply to draw out of the past what is always present and what is rooted in some fundamental quality or qualities, which even now are verifiable and present in lived experience. It is to turn away from humanity in favor of humans. A fundamental feature of fascism is its militarism, perhaps even imperialism. National monarchy rejects both in favor of autarky and discreteness. Respect for the sovereignty of every people would render redundant wars of conquest, and should they break out, it would require only the combined efforts of other national monarchies with their defensive forces to put right the situation. Additionally, fascism is an ideology of homogeneity. The state, the people, their culture, all must be one unity. We reject this entirely in favor of regionalism, federation, and communitarianism. It is difference which is the substratum of particularity, which we hold to be most valuable, and the state exists simply to safeguard and foster it by defending as a minimal criterion the race, whichever one it may be in a specific geographical area. The NSDAP, conversely, was chauvinist and sought racial domination as well as extermination. We reject these as deeply immoral. In alignment with the essentially progressive character of fascism, it sought to maximize the nation's economic and social efficiency by eliminating all types of person who were not economically productive or who in other ways deviated from the social norm. In this sense, fascism was opposed to all kinds of difference and generally hostile to dependence. It proclaimed to serve the common good. However, that good was defined in terms of a vulgar collectivism, which subsumed the personality into the whole, rather than considering the personality to be an indispensable component of that whole. To some extent, the needs of the sick, ill, and underprivileged were met under the Nazi regime. However, the programs meant for their caretaking were simply holdovers from the Weimar government, were supported by slave labor in the labor camps, and generally were rather paltry and underfunded. As such, National Socialism may have been national, but it was not in any meaningful sense social. If the common good is, in fact, not common, but rather particular to the producers and the upright persons in society, then it is not the common good. A truly social state, like that which national monarchism intends to build, cares for all within the race without distinction. Fascism was essentially Faustian in spirit. It sought not just the persistence of the Volk, but also its expansion and growth. This entailed also the growth of the economy, the growth of industry and profit, the growth of capital, as well as the growth of populations and borders. National monarchy is oriented against growth and against the Faustian spirit, in favor of the classical notion of limits. People should only have what is necessary for their needs. Hence, the policy of self-reliance ensures the stability of the social order, whilst constraining the appetite for growth. The one commonality our system has with fascism is perhaps that it is a corporate state, and national monarchy, through its system of guilds and charters, proposes a kind of corporatism. However, if corporatism is a minimal necessary definition of fascism, then we must accuse Pope Leo XIII of fascism, as well as Plato, Aristotle, and the Romans. To propose a corporate state is to propose what has been normal throughout all human history, a common strain that fascism had only tapped into without truly accomplishing, owing to its mix of proletarianism and profit. Lastly, fascism was proletarian. Though it harbored pretensions of class collaboration, in reality, its system of ethics was based entirely around the worker and his sacrifices. The name of the Nazi Party, National Socialist German Workers' Party, elucidates this fact. The worker was held in the highest esteem because he was the basis of society through his productive labor. The laborer, because he did not earn his living through speculation, was held up above certain members of the bourgeoisie, at least in theory. These states were thoroughly popular, as all dictatorships are. National monarchy, however, is distinct. It is not popular, but rather ruled by a hereditary nobility, and it reproduces the ancient hierarchies that have always been normal in all societies, but in a different context. Each member is valuable, not just the worker. Its basis is a true organic collaboration and unity of classes, each of which contributes with its unique gifts to the common good. It must also be said that fascism lends itself to a socialist drift, which requires periodic purges of the party and populace. The proletarian rhetoric employed by fascists tends to be rather seriously taken by the working class, which finds ready scores of national Bolshevik intellectuals ready to deliver into their arms a new doctrine of liberation. The genuine advances which fascism can make, the creation of the corporate state, the integration of classes, would all be lost in a class eliminationist fervor, which turns the proletarian masses against the bourgeoisie and the rest of the state. Fascism, because it does not recognize a proper dignity for each class, ultimately pits them against one another, necessitating extreme pressure to prevent their conflict. Given that this pressure is necessary, the fascist state licenses essentially nothing to those who produce political ideas. One must only be a functionary, a technician, or an apologist. Julius Evola experienced this firsthand when he, despite having materially aided the fascist regimes on numerous occasions, was attacked by the black shirts before escaping out a window. It was only due to his connections with prominent party members that Evola could continue writing, even while critiquing the regime in certain publications. It is this hypervigilance against subversives and agitators that prevents the natural, normal, and healthy negotiation of the boundaries of policy. One could state legitimately that national monarchy is only a stepping stone to an imponderable future system. Political systems do not last forever. They all have an expiration date. It is possible that the world of omniparticularity may disappear or be subsumed once again in racial conflict. Perhaps it may only be a momentary truce between the peoples before they resume what has been the norm throughout all human history, group conflict. Only the arrogant would proclaim that their system will persist throughout all time, exist in all places, and not fall to subversion, decay, or ideological drift. It is precisely this paranoia regarding change that motivates all fascists to stamp down with jackboots all dissent. National monarchy can tolerate dissent precisely because it aims for a dynamic condition. As Evola put it, units orbiting around a stable center. The democratic mania in which one battles for the minds of the people or popular opinion would not exist, and as such, the state should have no concern with the existence of sedition or dissent. It is perhaps the only merit of liberal governments that they, in some cases, permit free expression. The present doctrine would be impossible without such a right. It is, therefore, both expedient and desirable that national monarchy should allow the public its share of opinion. Fascism was an inevitable development in Europe, given that the First World War had discredited its monarchies and thus its right, and also that communism was becoming increasingly popular and forceful. Liberalism proved too spineless an opponent against socialists. The weakness of the Weimar Republic, which bred much revolutionary fervor, as well as its tendency towards social democracy, proved that it could not be a point of condensation for conservatives. The point of view of the conservative revolutionaries is sympathetic, but they cannot garner the necessary popular support to serve as a legitimate right-wing movement. Fascism, by adopting certain elements from left-wing discourse, as well as by appealing to the disaffected and impoverished workers, was able to secure a rapid lead. In Italy, likewise, the backward conditions of the economy, the instability of its political situation, as well as the lack of a true right and the emergence of socialist power contributed to Mussolini's rise. Naturally, in the wake of World War I, the only formalizations that could condense were military ones. Europe had just experienced the possibility of explosive warfare, which convinced nations that they must be better armed and more strictly regimented. Russia, likewise, had a similar experience, resulting in that military formalization that was the Soviet state. Fascism, which valued above all the sacrifices of the soldier and the worker, was most possible under such conditions. Given the relative lack of racially foreign contact in Europe, with the exception of the Ashkenazi Jewish population, as well as the atomization that took place after the emergence of liberal governance, group formalizations were unlikely, and something like them could only be approximated through a military order, which explains the association between fascism and the Volk. Fascism, however, could not ultimately reconstitute the ancient or medieval groups, which at one point were the main basis for European rule. It had to envisage a new kind of group, the homogeneous racial nation. This is but a poor substitute for the tight bonds Europeans enjoyed in the past. Fascism, if it had not been defeated in war, was probably primed to fail at a later point, simply because homogeneous nations are brittle and prone to the kind of factionalism which later broke apart the USSR, i.e. the split between reformers and orthodox socialists. A state order that total cannot cater to the needs nor foster the development of all the variegated groups of originary humans who are bound to exist under any state formalization. Fascism, like all dictatorial ideologies, is simply emergency government meant to stabilize populations, encounter threats, and repair economies. We intend to offer, on the other hand, a permanent solution to the question of governance. Julius Evolas' criticisms of fascism are quite apt. This form of nationalism is based entirely in the Volk and not in a higher principle. Having its basis in the multitude, it is democratic and popular, and thus results in the most irrational forms of dictatorial exercise possible, Hitler's invasion of Czechoslovakia. It inverts traditional modes of rule just as much as does socialism or liberalism. It is just as devoid of spirit as the worst forms of political modernity, and moreover, it tends to simply reproduce forms of bourgeois morality which have no place in a true state. Instrumental culture. Culture famously eludes precise definition, so much so that it appears upon inspection that there is no such thing, or that whatever region is the locus of said inspection appears to have no culture, or at least that it fails to differentiate itself from elsewhere. Yet one has the distinct impression that one lives in a particular culture, that one's habits, one's manners, one's tastes are indelibly stamped with the mark of his people, such that one would feel uncomfortable elsewhere among strangers. This experience elucidates the problem. Culture only presents to us in lived experience. Reason is not an adequate tool to encompass or circumscribe culture, precisely because culture is conducted largely without recourse to reason, perhaps even without recourse to discourse in general. In the final analysis, culture is only possible to understand in terms of culture. One can readily discern the difference between Italian and Japanese paintings. The medium is different, canvas versus wood. The style is different, Renaissance realism versus medieval symbolism. The symbols themselves are distinct. One's impression, likewise, is distinct. Yet to discern what is distinctly Japanese about such paintings with only reference to the Japanese would be impossible. Most descriptions of social differences between cultures are unverifiable, precisely because true culture is unquantifiable. In the West current era, the predominance of capitalism and its consumerism, we have, however, approached as near as possible to a culture of quantity. Culture is measured in terms of market share, rates of consumption or purchase, tickets at the box office, demographics, etc. Such culture is a mirage. it is nothing. It can be transported across borders and consumed by anyone. It has so much become the air that we breathe that we can scarcely imagine a person who doesn't recognize Luke Skywalker or Batman. Our heroes are no longer Joan of Arc, Odysseus, Achilles, or Charlemagne. Instead, modernity has substituted various simulacra that, because they are so formless, can easily cross borders and become the heroes of others too. Global culture, because it is so quantifiable, so substanceless, and so indistinct, no longer has the character of culture. It is no longer tied to a territory or a people. It no longer concerns the ways in which people interact or the ways in which people delineate themselves. It has sublimated everything that belongs to a locality into a planetized super identity, which belongs to everyone because it belongs to no one. That is part of the difficulty behind the apparent impossibility of sensing a modern culture. Now that men have no integral culture with which to compare to others, since their integral cultures are being dissolved also, it appears that culture does not exist. The more empirically minded men of the right have declared such, that there is no such thing as culture. Perhaps Margaret Thatcher was implying something on this order when she said, there is no such thing as society. What lives in its stead is the market and its relations of production and consumption. Culture is valued only to the extent it can be commodified and sold. Brands, in fact, have become culture, as was predicted in the 80s film Demolition Man. In such a wasteland, how can men hope to reclaim a sense of distinctness, territory, and being? It is necessary first that the mass market be abolished and what remaining market relations exist, recontextualized in a qualitative direction. Part of the reason for the decline of culture is precisely the result of the mass of the market and the accordingly massified nature of artistic productions. It is the nature of this media as marketable entertainment which is most responsible for the problem. Art which may have in earlier times endeavored to probe the human condition or explore philosophical ideas now must cater to the appetites of the lowest sort of man who simply wants to be stimulated rather than prompted with questions or thoughts. Likewise, the mass nature of media eliminates the possibility of personal interactions, which militates against the formation of customs. Once custom becomes reduced to consumption, then culture becomes a purely private and individual act, impossible to share. Without sharing, there is no sociality, and without sociality, there is no culture. An effort should be made to promote the local enjoyment of regional arts as much as possible. Accordingly, such an effort would not be possible without a stringent regionalism and the freedom of those regions to breathe. Lastly, it would be necessary, above all, to abide by omniparticularity, to defend the possession of homelands by particular races such that they can form and maintain a discrete and unique culture. Adorno observed what he called the culture industry, which is the mass production of media meant to inculcate the values of liberal capitalism within the public. It has a specific purpose, to dull class consciousness and distract its consumer from his immiseration and exploitation. The deployment of mass culture for political ends is a species of instrumental culture, which by virtue of its artificial character leaves its recipient alienated from his class, his people, his community, and even his nation. This sublimation of culture and identity to the purposes of the state is deliberate. The culture ministered to the people must first break down the sense of personhood before they will become willing participants in a totalitarian order. It must substitute for sociality the iron fist of the state and the equally forceful hand of the bourgeoisie, which ultimately determines one's behavior rather than the complex nexus of negotiations and discourses ordinarily carried out by communities. Since culture is only explicable in terms of culture, states cannot understand it. They can only manufacture a system of prohibitions and imperatives couched in ideo-humanitarian or even religious drapery, which compels a certain type of desired behavior. Artificial hierarchies, such as those found in militaries, have something of this character, awards given that have meaning only in terms of an instrumental purpose, such as facilitating valor, i.e. following orders. Instrumentality is ultimately only explicable in terms of instrumentality. Thus, culture finds its true inversion. In America, much of black culture falls under this definition, in the sense that it is an artificial construct made for ideo-humanitarian purposes. The most ridiculed example is Kwanzaa, which was created in 1966 by Maulana Karenga. It was meant to give black people an alternative to the existing holiday of Christmas and give black people an opportunity to celebrate themselves and their history rather than to simply imitate the practice of the dominant society. In other words, it is merely an instrument to oppose the culture of the white majority population of the United States, which has been as part of a cultural revolution, which was to precede a violent revolution. Kwanzaa is, at its root, a response to the tragic loss of African culture experienced by American blacks as a consequence of the slave trade. This, as will be exposited later, renders it a kind of anti-culture or reaction. Fragments of real African cultures are appropriated, reinterpreted, synthesized, and recontextualized into an artificial and inorganic construction which is meant to replace the emergent culture which has been formed in the new environment. It is without surprise that the majority of Black people in the United States, who have been reared in a largely Christian environment, celebrate Christmas instead of Kwanzaa, partly because this is how the actual organic culture of the United States has turned out. To react against that, to return to an African past, which the African American now has scarcely any connection with, is merely to fall into a pit. It is akin to white Europeans attempting to return to paganism, despite having lived their entire lives in a thoroughly Christian Europe. Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony has been rather influential in the decades after the decline of fascism. It has made its way circuitously to the right, partly due to the influence of the Nouvelle Droite, where it has now inspired currents of theocrats who call themselves Christian nationalists. His idea, however, makes little sense when removed from its context. Gramsci posited that part of the way capitalism maintains its power is through control of culture. The mores that people hold, the positive value of production, the negative value of dependence, the justness of self-reliance, as well as certain concepts people believe, the connection between individualism and freedom, contribute to generating a universal assent to the capitalist mode of production and bourgeois rule. These Christian nationalists have simplified his theory into a mere truism. Politics is downstream from culture. This truism is not just descriptive, but rather it is also revolutionary praxis. To accomplish political victory, they believe that one must wage a culture war through pressuring the public to conform to their conservative Christian values. This involves, among other things, producing conservative media, criticizing progressive or left-wing media, boycotting the products of progressive companies, utilizing political means to prohibit left-wing cultural views from dominating in educational spaces, and eventually directly controlling culture politically through speech prohibitions. By conceiving of the necessity of a culture war, conservatives are just ratifying Gramsci rather than appropriating him. They have proven that a conservative culture is a necessary underpinning of capitalist relations, and as such, to oppose an anti-capitalist revolution, they must take direct control over culture. This conception of culture as a political instrument, however, does not produce culture, it produces anti-culture. Oswald Spengler, in Decline of the West, defined culture as the original feeling that inspired society. That feeling came from the race, and it was more or less inimical to that race. In this sense, a culture is like a colony of bacteria, which goes also by the name culture. It is discrete, even isolated. When it comes into contact with other organisms, or when it is not isolated, it might be destroyed. Culture, in Spengler's sense, is thus organic and integral. Instrumental culture is an artificial construction that, by its very nature, is not negotiated socially by the people who are subjected to it. A truly integral culture is the result of centuries of social negotiation and the formation of unique customs, social parameters, values, and mores which are imposed upon a social group in this process of negotiation in favor of total dictation by the state. Thus, the culture war, in the final analysis, is a totalitarian attempt to reduce humans to instruments of the state and its values. Spengler's notion of civilization elucidates the matter. Instrumental culture only appears once societies reach the civilizational stage, at which point they have lost touch with their culture and have ossified into a brittle state which, nonetheless, bristles with activity, ingenuity, and expansion. At this point, societies must attempt to recreate some semblance of what was lost, for which reason they produce various kinds of romantic art, i.e. the Gothic, the Baroque. However, in the twilight years of civilization, even that becomes impossible, owing to the discontinuous break made with the past. Reaction then appears on the scene as a response to the gnawing void, as well as the emergence of dissolutive forces, i.e. socialist materialism, which have been set in motion by the break from qualitative culture. This reaction will hasten to return to culture, but it will be fundamentally unable to accomplish it, since the organic feeling has already gone. It will compensate by constructing a veneer of traditional culture, which is instrumental in nature simply because the people have become thoroughly modern. As we can see, the impulse to return is not a sign of an impending restoration, but rather the last phases in the decline of its civilization. Special attention should be paid to the proposed religious nature of this instrumental culture. Religion, when transformed by political instrumentality into a force of power, loses its essence and instead becomes performative. Muslims say that there is no compulsion in religion, by which they mean that religion is purely a matter of the ascent of the soul and its turning toward God. He who is turned only in physical body toward a doctrine is not, in reality, fully participating in that religion. The theocracy Christian nationalists wish to create is, like all traditionalism, merely a performance of the past in an unwilling modernity. Religion, reduced to power and performance, becomes in its entirety political. It has not occurred to such theocrats that to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's is the central exhortation of the Bible on such matters. In other words, to make of religion a political instrument is to seriously damage the possibility of that religion resulting in faith. Religion, in fact, does not belong to Caesar. On the other hand, rulers have their power with the authority of God, and monarchs serve as the stewards of that highest authority on earth. It is thus incumbent upon them to inculcate religious values in so much as they can without carrying out aforesaid reduction. Such an endeavor requires subtle distinctions between compulsion and inculcation. An educational curriculum which requires reading of the Bible, as well as some training in theology, does no harm as it merely exposes the public to the proper teachings without compelling them to follow. However, to outlaw all that is prohibited in the Bible, to create censorship boards, to persecute those who follow other faiths, these are truly religious compulsion and will only have the effect of reducing, once again, faith to performance. The allowance of emergent negotiation with social and ethical limits creates the necessary space in society for communities to live and breathe. Men and women may locally decide what to prohibit, what to give license to, who to associate with, and how their faith should be conducted, if any. Culture thus remains emergent, organic, and integral. Essence is thereby not reduced to performance. Totalitarianism is avoided. Social negotiation is necessary due to the amount of difference present within any given state. In modern Europe and in the United States, religious belief is declining, and a sizable plurality of people are non-Christian or atheists. The creation and maintenance of communities under such a condition would require that the state give people the freedom to determine their mores, beliefs, and customs themselves. The effort to inculcate Christian beliefs will not be entirely successful, and there will always be groups who deviate from the norm in some way, such as various types of bohemian artists. To allow such groups to form their own communities, where they will be unencumbered by the state's professed culture, would all but eradicate the phenomenon of cultural revolutions, i.e., Stonewall, Pride, 68, etc. Absent such revolutions, the position of the state will be secure. National monarchy can withstand the absence of explicit cultural support due to its regionalism and communitarianism. The main impetus behind instrumental culture is a reaction against the precarious state of the power apparatus under democratic conditions. Under democracy, the state is only legitimate to the extent to which it represents its constituents. As such, if the polity is liberal, an anti-LGBT state will be seen as illegitimate, even fascistic. If the polity is conservative, then a progressive state will be seen as illegitimate. By eliminating the democratic state and breaking down the units of power into federated regions, and then under this federated regions, granting individual communities the power to determine norms, such orthogonies will not weigh upon the state's legitimacy. Instrumental culture then becomes counterproductive. Instrumental culture is fundamentally a path toward totalitarianism. It reproduces the homogeneity of the fascist state from within ostensibly democratic conditions. It is thus not much of an exaggeration and only slightly doctrinally inaccurate when leftists proclaim that Christian nationalism is a species of fascism, no matter how capitalist or counter-revolutionary it may be. It is in the interest of autonomy, meant in the sense of belonging to a group, stability, and faith, that we oppose instrumental culture. Conservative writer Roger Scruton perhaps prefigured this development when he argued that there is no separation between society and the state. Some truth may be found in this statement. Formalizations always condense around pre-existing cultural and social centers, and they exist partly to maintain them. However, there nonetheless remains a distinction. The state apparatus, which is the enforcer and determiner of laws, is merely the guarantor of society. When it encroaches into the social life itself, arrogating itself to the station of the nexus of sociality itself, it ends up rendering free sociality redundant or impossible, for which reason a totalitarian state cannot be said to have a society in the narrow sense of that term, i.e., a series of self-determined interrelationships between groups. Instead, what emerges is a unity between the power of command and the people who are commanded, which becomes their sole relationship insofar as no or little resistance emerges. This unity is the basis for fascism, and thus those brands of conservatism that wish to combine the social tie and the state into a single entity are ultimately fascistic, and in the final analysis are flawed for the very same reasons fascism is flawed. Naturally, instrumental culture has left-wing variants as well. LGBT representation in media is not meant to fulfill a serious need on the part of the public for gay, lesbian, or trans characters. In most cases, sexuality does not factor into a character's actions or the plot, and so it merely becomes lore meant to subvert the moral systems of conservative and religious types. In other words, it is meant to shock a heteronormative society, which ultimately is no longer shocked. The affirmative purpose behind such representation is to foster the values of pluralism and inclusivity, which militates in the direction of an egalitarian society devoid of all qualitative distinctions. The manner in which this representation is carried out elucidates its purpose. Gay characters are disallowed from having any of the typical qualities frequently associated with homosexuals, which they do, in fact, often display. To depict a gay character with gay qualities would be stereotypification, and thus this is disallowed. It operates against the purpose of such instrumental representation, which is to flatten all differences and nullify one's pattern recognition capabilities. Racial representation serves to adjust the white population's attitude in favor of non-white pluralities and eventually majorities. To accustom white people to seeing Black or Asian protagonists rather than white ones shapes their attitude in such a way as to condition them to the experience of being secondary within their own countries. The accusation made by leftists against writers or artists who center stories on white experiences or characters that they are rendering non-white secondary is simply projection. The motivation behind such representation is thoroughly anti-white rather than truly egalitarian. This instrumental culture is a pure artificiality which does not mirror the ways races and sexual minorities concretely interact with each other. For this reason, no one genuinely values such culture, and all expressions of it are merely performative or political. Despite the efforts of those who instrumentalize racial representation, interracial marriage rates in the United States are very low, 17% in 2015. The natural, organic, in-group preference of peoples is difficult to condition away, and as such, despite the deployment of instrumental culture, people's behaviors are not modified. Such would be the fate of all instrumental culture, which does not apply force to facilitate compliance. This left-wing instrumental culture is not a meaningful threat to the capitalist order. Capitalism can function with gay Black CEOs and trans representatives. It ratifies the notion of liberation as simply being the presence of minorities in positions of power without fundamentally engaging any skepticism or rejection of said forms of power. For this reason, it cannot carry out any sort of Gramscian cultural political revolution. Likewise, the conservative cultural war only reinforces the existing system. It has only the aura of revolution without in any serious way damaging the legitimacy of the existing institutions. Revolutionary impulses must be coupled with an active political effort to undermine the legitimacy of power structures, otherwise they will only produce superstructural changes. Against liberalism. Carl Schmitt's friend-enemy distinction is a rather useful and parsimonious lens through which to view political conflicts. It cuts through doctrinal distortions and forces one to recognize who, in concrete relational terms, one is aligned with. It is a step out of discourse into the realm of action. What is the primary enemy of the right? Hitherto it has been the left, communists, socialists, etc. However, to define as the primary enemy leftist is to implicitly put oneself into an alliance with liberals who are in charge of the ruling system. The greatest obstacle to the realization of racial and originary consciousness is not, in fact, the left, but rather the atomized individualism and sublimated forms of identity which originate in liberal ideology. Most of those downward features of leftist ideology likewise originate out of liberalism, not necessarily the doctrines of Marx or Engels. Marx hesitated to ever use the term equality. He criticized the doctrine of the rights of man. It is, in fact, liberalism which casts a humanitarian net across concrete humans, stultifying the discourse. Nonetheless, as certain conservative authors have noted, there is indeed today some continuity in principle between liberalism and communism. Communism, as it has now developed, has simply taken the liberal revolution to its natural conclusion, the leveling of all hierarchies, the universal brotherhood of mankind, equality, etc. Thus, to combat communism, one must combat also liberalism. To oppose one but not the other, even worse, to labor under the delusion that liberals such as conservatives can be our allies, is to seriously jeopardize the possibility of a right-wing revolution. The age in which liberalism was truly revolutionary has passed, and it now is in its reactionary phase. As such, revolutionaries must view liberalism as the most hardened encapsulation of intransigence and conservation. For this reason, a thorough critique of the liberal idea and order is necessary. We have already said much about the irrationality of the individual and the negative consequences which stem therefrom. The whole basis of the liberal philosophy is this individual, including its formulation of natural rights. Without the individual as its basis, natural rights cannot be sustained. Persons are comprised of differences, and thus the principle of equality cannot apply. Without equality, then all other rights fail as well, since a regime of unequal rights and duties is implied by the basic condition of humanities. This irrevocable right to property, the right to the pursuit of happiness, the right of representation, all of this falls away. In its place is simple sovereignty, which originates in a divine mandate. Liberalism, because its sovereignty is popular and universal, is potentially the most totalitarian regime which can possibly exist. As Foucault has written, to individualize power is to render the subject a valid point of control. Once the subject has been made subservient to power, the whole totality of human life can be controlled. Moreover, as Bertrand de Juvenal has observed, unlimited sovereignty means unlimited power. There is no right that the people can violate, is the formula of popular sovereignty, and as such, all democratic forms of government eventually end in tyranny. Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, these are the type of system which eventually grow out of the liberal soil. We also face the possibility of the emergence of a new totalitarian system, managed democracy, in which democratic processes and trust therein underlie the legitimacy of the state's true sovereigns. Meanwhile, those processes are controlled by elites to produce the desired instrumental result. Something of this sort can be sensed in the Russian Federation, as well as several countries in South America, which are only nominally democratic. The democratic process itself is suspect for the simple reason that it operates oligarchically, i.e., the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Wealthy bourgeois donors fund parties and facilitate campaigns in return for an expectation that the candidate in question executes policies amenable to those donors. Lobby groups are very influential, and millions of dollars are spent to influence representatives toward the desired outcome. Likewise, politicians tend to create policies and regulations that benefit their friends, family, or in-group rather than the common good, simply because term limits encourage robbing the treasury. De Juvenal discerned that there is a political machine which is run according to oligarchic mechanisms, which determines the whole course of democratic politics. It is a system of parties which is central, since all politics revolves around service to the party rather than the people. Accordingly, democracy serves to obscure the power centers that exist within a democracy. De Juvenal conceived of a mass of power which exists within a democracy called the imperium, which is the totality of hard and soft power which can be brought to bear through power relationships. Elites battle over this imperium, utilizing it one day to oppress the people and the next day to oppress each other. As such, the liberal refrain that democracy is a system of liberty is facile. Democracy is every bit as authoritarian as autocracies, perhaps even more so, given that it is somewhat distributed and invisible, and thus capable of accomplishing much more with much less resistance. In this sense, an autocracy, i.e. monarchy, can be much more liberal than liberalism. He who already possesses power by virtue of his birth need not strive to acquire it, and absent that striving, he has no reason to exercise it totally. He is not responsive to a party or base which he must please by punishing its opponents and making effective use of the levers of power. Rather, he acts only when it is necessary, when there is a legitimate problem to solve or conflict to resolve. The representative system is cause for many of the failures of democracy to genuinely respond to the people's needs and demands. To entrust as an avatar of the people a political technician simply results in his drift away from his constituency and toward the demands of the state and its raison d'etat. Without the right of recall and without a mechanism of voluntary political dissolution, there is no recourse against a bad representative. Bad politicians simply fail a re-election. Bad monarchs suffer the sword of Damocles. It has been said by another that there are only two species of government, monarchy and oligarchy. It is clear, after democracy has been demystified by de Juvenal and Hoppe, that this statement is correct. Democracy is suited to the mercantile capitalist regime. Monarchy is suited to the qualitative regime. It is the presence of personality in all quarters in society, the economy, and the government that monarchy aims to accomplish. Conversely, democracy only begets a faceless multitude from a faceless multitude. Its head, the executive, is merely a symbol in dukes. Democracy has no equivalent to the monarch because it is the headless, phantasmal captain of a wayward ship. All parliamentarism results in a dual crisis: the non-existence of political centrality, which paralyzes choice and eliminates idealistic vision, as well as the asymptotic increase of laws and regulations, which becomes an unnavigable forest. In times of crisis, democracies cannot act with the necessary decisiveness nor determinateness. In times of peace, regulatory overload renders life uncertain and action motionless. Before absolutism and the creation of parliaments, monarchy was a generally weak form of government by reason of its lack of bureaucratic centralization. It was difficult to tax to a large extent and difficult to maintain a standing army. The liberal advent of parliaments did not decrease the power of the state against the people, but rather enhanced it. Parliament was a necessary technology to enable the monarch to tax his subjects to greater extents and in much more minute ways. It becomes clear that the more liberal a government becomes, the more powerful it becomes. Now let us take as our point of departure the historical assumptions of the liberal worldview. Its most striking feature is its progressivism, the belief in a linear improvement of human society, ethics, knowledge, economy, etc. through time. This is, ultimately, just a form of historicism which is not verifiable. What mechanism drives historical progress? Hegel attempted to answer this question through his idealism, which itself is unproven and in contravention to the metaphysics of every established tradition. We thus cannot adopt the Hegelian view. Parsimoniously, one can observe in the world that progress is not uniform, does not result in the same types of society, nor operates on all peoples and all places. As such, the liberal notion of progress is simply a meta-narrative without foundation or reality. It is evident that the various types of society which were once thought to be at the forefront of human progress, i.e. the USSR, Marxism, that these have failed. Progress can be either retrograde, in which case the meta-narrative is wrong, or it does actually take place due to historical accident. If we do adopt a historicist frame, then it is to the notion of linear regressive time that we must have reference to, as all world traditions, particularly Christianity, prophesy that human civilization and character will decline until the end of time. Much of what appears to be progress to the liberal conscience is, in fact, decay, the breakdown of human relationships and bonds, the destruction of identities, the growth of the market and of certain advanced technologies which aim to dominate humans, the growth of secular attitudes, the breakdown of gender normativity, and so forth. We can readily admit to the reality of material progress. However, this material progress has not been, in its whole, beneficial for mankind. If one were to even grant it the charity that it has allowed more people to live much more fully than they otherwise would have, we must ultimately acknowledge that the price has been the integrity of our planet, and eventually the integrity of humans themselves. As the Frankfurt School has stated, the underside of positivism's domination of nature is the domination of humans. Positivism must be recontextualized and set under strict limits such that it does not outstrip ethics. It is to the consequences of instrumental reason that we should pay close attention to. Genetic engineering threatens to disrupt categorical integrity, to turn what is in reality a mandate of God for human particularity into license for human indistinction. Such engineering, besides, results in a number of class-based inequalities which would be rather pernicious. Cybernetics also threaten to destroy human economy entirely in favor of control by elites or the bourgeoisie, who will now have a class of tireless laborers with which to dispense. The atomizing effect of modern consumer culture, the mass market, as well as the somewhat corrosive effect of the internet, will be multiplied tenfold by the merging of our phenomenological experience with machines. For these reasons, the unconstrained growth of technology must be abated. The National Monarchist State. Let us now briefly adumbrate the points of the National Monarchist State program. To reiterate, the main impetus behind national monarchy is the predominance of the qualitative over the quantitative. As such, the state is hierarchical, hereditary, autocratic, and federated. It is conceived of as such that it will dominate over the economy, determining its organization, rather than to allow the economy to dominate over the state. As such, the premise of national monarchy is what Julius Evola referred to as the true state, which consists of free units moving around a stable center, comprised of men who are ready to answer the call to action when it is sounded. It is based in the free exchange of fealty, bonds, relations, and concrete ties rather than abstract contracts or exchanges. The state will be corporatist in the form of guild organization. To conduct business, a proprietor must be a member of a state-created guild for his particular industry. There might be a music guild, a film guild, a vehicle guild, a culinary guild, and so on. Then, he must seek a charter for his business from the Crown or Crown representative, who will examine the business proposal, the intent of the owner to treat and pay his employees well, the working conditions, and so forth. Once this is satisfied, then the guild will demarcate a specific market area in which the business may operate. Such delimitation of the market area is intended to prevent the formation of a mass market, as well as to encourage cooperation rather than competition between business owners. There will be no system of patents or intellectual property. All innovations made in business will be free for others to adopt and utilize. The guild may set prices, production quotas, determine how goods are produced, etc., if need be, but a preference will be made to allow the business owners as much autonomy in the course of his business as possible. Agriculture will be conducted on the basis of private smallholding. Large estates or bourgeois-owned farmland can be broken up and sold to the masses in order to grant to as many as possible the benefit of owning the land on which they work. Cooperatives may be allowed if the masses so desire them. Imports and exports will be strictly prohibited unless there is some emergency need for a given good or material. National monarchy advances a policy of autarky intended to preserve the particularity of peoples and cultures, as well as the integrity of the political order. A government which falls to the allure of international mercantile interests cannot possibly guarantee the well-being of the people. It is hoped as well that autarky can minimize international disputes over resources from being a cause of conflicts. This autarky, however, may be delimited in the case where the alliance of several nations is required for the maintenance of omniparticularity. Defensive alliances may be formed, and member states may trade resources for the purpose of facilitating a strong defensive military. Military production will be nationalized, as the creation of a sufficiently strong military requires the import of resources from all around the nation, as well as the cooperation of a great many people. Finance will be heavily controlled. The state must approve of all loans given. Usury will be outlawed, and all loans or investments will be made simply as a charitable contribution, perhaps with the addition of a small fee meant for the upkeep of the financial institution. The elimination of the financial sector ensures that capitalism cannot reform and that businesses do not outstrip supply or demand in the midst of their attempts to grow. Rates of growth will be slow, and a general project of degrowth must take place within society. The state itself will follow religious principles, admitting no one into government who seriously violates or disbelieves in its precepts. State education will be conducted along such religious lines, inculcating spiritual attitudes within the population. However, such an effort does not extend to the private sphere. Communities are given the freedom to determine their customs, beliefs, and traditions. Such a policy is expedient for allowing the coexistence of numerous different groups within the same state, which maintain their respective distinctness. The type of monarchy preferred is absolutist and hereditary. Absolutist because the centralization of power is necessary to carry out the economic program of the state, and hereditary in order to avoid democratic conflicts and to allow for socio-political continuity, particularity of certain idealistic visions. To maintain a system which requires strict ideological coherence and philosophical elaboration requires a type of education that can only be fostered in a hereditary environment. National monarchy will be comprised of a single nation state within which may exist several ethnicities within a race. The state will be federated. Beneath the monarch are so many hereditary lords who will rule their respective regions, which are delineated according to the ethnic stock and culture of their respective peoples. These lords will, ideally, be from the same stock as those whom they rule. Within these regions, local communities will be free to practice forms of direct democracy, such as the election of an alderman who will determine the local laws, enforce customs, as well as serve as a representative of the community to the lord. Such a system is similar to the way the Ancien regime operated. National monarchy aims to create a social state centered around the common good. Welfare, unemployment or injury insurance, perhaps even universal health care may be offered according to the available resources of the state. All within the race are eligible without exception. These programs will be paid for by high taxes on the richest bourgeoisie, who after the revolution in values should be eager to contribute to the common order. If necessary, then limited trade may be opened up and tariffs instituted to raise revenue. Finally, the state must observe, at all costs, the principle of omniparticularity, both within and without. The accomplishment of national monarchy cannot take place instantly. The establishment of its political institutions must proceed in a gradual manner. First, the executive of the liberal state will be converted into the hereditary office of a monarch. The existing machinery of the liberal state will suffice for a time. However, eventually this is also to be replaced. Those organs which regulate commerce must become agencies prepared to offer charters and cooperate with guilds. The framework for the existence of the corporate guilds must be established, and special attention must be paid to the leadership of the military, which cannot be allowed to mutiny or disobey. Once the military is seized, then the monarch can proceed with dissolving parliament. The legislative authority will then go to the monarch or his representatives. A comprehensive project of the review of all the laws must then take place, and all liberal judges must be fired and then replaced with those loyal to the principles of national monarchy. The same process must unfold also at the level of provinces, which, once subjugated, must be placed under the control of pre-selected lords. At this point, the central bank can be seized and usury entirely banned. An audit must be made of all businesses, and a general proclamation must be made urging proprietors and owners, the bourgeoisie in general, to join their respective guilds. Markets will be split up between companies depending on the location of their factories or warehouses. Space may open up for the creation of new industries, and large trusts may be broken up to facilitate greater geographic coverage. Once the economy has been reorganized, tariffs of gradually increasing severity can be introduced with the aim of reducing reliance on imports, thus also reducing the commercial connectivity of businesses to foreign market actors. These tariffs, once they reach a certain point of severity, must then be combined with a concerted effort by the state to invest in domestic manufacturing and resource extraction. After internal supply chains have been established, then it will be possible to completely ban imports and exports.